I don't know why he adopted a child of misfortune, nor why he makes me nurse him. There are so many wet nurses available, the woman muttered in a tone full of complaint, but she had to fulfill her duties. Princess Ursa didn't have much of a choice, let's say, so she left her newborn son Zuko at Shisui's side before she took him in her arms and examined him carefully, especially his skin. What a miserable life you will have. I guess we have a lot in common, don't you think? I just hope you end up better off than me, the woman said before she started to nurse Shisui. Don't curse me, woman, your life is a drama I don't want to experience, Shisui thought absent-mindedly while he was being fed, feeling familiar yet distant security. I guess this is real mother love. Shisui didn't know why he felt this way, but in a way, this experience allowed his mind to relax. He constantly had thoughts and internal dialogues to somehow calm his fears. He didn't like this world, he didn't like any fictional world, no, the idea of living in it didn't appeal to him. I never thought about being reborn or transmigrated, and even if a wasteland covered in radioactive ash and nuclear snow wasn't the best, it was my world, I didn't want to leave it just like that, although maybe it was the influence of that thing. Shisui continued to mentally ramble until his mind gradually shut down from the sleepiness he felt. 3 years later. Look Shisui, I can make fire. A small 3-year-old boy ran up to another of the same age. Although they were similar in age, they were dressed differently, the former wearing red, gold, and black clothes, indicating his status as a prince, while the boy wore only black clothes, a kind of negative symbol. Strangely enough, however, both of them had good complexions, indicating that neither of them had suffered any hardships, and aside from the difference in their skin color and clothing, neither of them was particularly different from the other. Incredible, Shisui waved his arms in the pond that was located in a certain open area of the castle, his smooth movements causing ripples in the water without even touching it, as if that element was under the boy's complete control. Indeed it was. At the age of 3, Shisui already knew that he could control water like his deceased mother. Although the servants looked at him more and more badly because of it, none of them dared to play a trick on him, because, after all, the royal family was behind him. You don't look excited, exclaimed the boy who was Zuko. No, I'm not, Shisui replied, floating a water balloon, but you could tell from the jagged and wobbly edges that it took a lot of effort. Great! Zuko shouted again at the sight of his friend Shisui's water ball, but Shisui simply stopped waving his arms and let the water fall. I need to learn more about water bending, Shisui mumbled, trying to replicate the moves he remembered from the show, but there was a lot of mystery and skill involved that couldn't be conveyed in an animation. Fortunately, he knew how to meditate. It was not as unbelievable as it might seem. Anyone can meditate, and he used it a lot in his first life to calm himself or control his gift, so he was very familiar with the action. But meditating was not a trick to gain super control abilities. If anything, it allowed him to gradually access the extraordinary energy of this world, the chi, but not much more. Zuko, do you want to race turtle ducks? Bored, Shisui invited Zuko to release the energy that every child has at this young age. All right, I'll beat you this time, promised Zuko, who went over to the pond to grab one of the little critters, oblivious to the subtle look Shisui gave him. You fool, I always cheat, you won't be able to beat me, the boy thought mischievously before he grabbed a turtle duck of his own. 1, 2, 3. 2. Boiling water. So, what's the point of knowing the existence of oxygen? Seeing the chemical reaction in front of him, Zuko could not help but ask such a question. If you know every aspect of your power, you can control it effectively, replied Shisui, who was engrossed at the tender age of 5 in repeating certain scientific experiments. How did he get a secluded room to do this? He told the kind Fire Lord Azulon of his desire to explore the material world extensively. Perhaps he could find something useful for the Fire Nation. Why is a 5-year-old boy able to converse with the Fire Lord, even though he is a son of misfortune? Did you forget that the man supported him? He was even kind enough to let him see the journal his mother had written for him, which was filled with knowledge about controlling water. That last one is kind of sad. His mother was in love with his father but had doubts and even fears about what might happen to him, so during her pregnancy, she wrote down all her knowledge in a notebook. From the basics of waterbending to more advanced arts like healing or creating ice, his mother summed up waterbending in one simple sentence, but it opened up a new world for Shisui: understand the element, its limits, and how far your imagination can go with it. Perhaps Azulon, or those who evaluated the journal before giving it to him, did not consider those words and wrote it off as some mystical nonsense, but it made Shisui begin to look at the supposed manipulation of the elements in this world with different eyes. It had clear rules: you used your energy to create or control the 4 elements, though each person could only control one unless you were the legendary avatar. Each element had things that others could learn and replicate. Living among the firebenders, with his characteristic battle-oriented style, Shisui unconsciously adapted his water control. Even if it felt uncomfortable at times, it allowed him to see a way beyond the usual. Iroh was able to create a technique that allowed him to redirect lightning by learning the basics of waterbending. Could he create something similar? Although he was still a novice, his ambitions were already reaching further and further, but he had to take it one step at a time. I don't understand. Isn't it just letting my anger and desire burn to create fire? Asked Zuko, not quite understanding what his friend Shisui was saying. Sometimes Zuko was jealous of the way his friend behaved and even how others reacted to his presence. Sometimes he tried to copy him, but it only made his little sister Azula, who was present, laugh. Silly Zuzu, if you can use this oxygen to make fire, you'll make stronger flames, won't you? Said little Azula, who had a habit of sneaking into Shisui's laboratory, and since he preferred to keep an eye on her to make sure she didn't mess with his things, he gave her permission to satisfy her curiosity. Exactly, oxygen is something that is in the air we breathe, along with other elements, although these do not react with our bodies, except for the mixture of oxygen with another called carbon, which is part of the breath you exhale, Shisui said, adjusting his long hair as it prevented him from seeing. No one dared to cut Shisui's hair for fear of hurting him with scissors or razors. There were some very radical people, and even if they had direct orders not to hurt him, accidents can happen. That was why his hair was so long. He hadn't cut it since he was born, and maybe because he was a waterbender, he had more vitality than others, which explained his luxuriant hair. Yes, the carbon dynamo, the one that makes little bubbles, cried Zuko excitedly, but he only heard his younger sister's mocking laughter. Carbon dioxide, silly Zuzu. It can be found in many things, like smoke, and it's poisonous in many variations, like Shisui said, Azula said, looking excitedly at the lab glassware, imagining what poisonous stuff was in there. Not exactly, carbon dioxide is not poison, it is the result of something natural. Plants eat it together with water and sunlight, releasing the oxygen we need, Shisui corrected. He didn't want to associate himself with the image of a poisoner, at least he wanted to wait until Azulon was dead, then he would have an excuse to study them. To the others, the Fire Lord only felt sorry for the tragic death of one of his generals and gave his son shelter. He didn't give him a status similar to royalty, but as a part of it, more than a servant, he was a companion. That's why even Ozai couldn't give him orders. Because to Azulon, Shisui represented his father's ideal, the unification of the 4 nations. That's why Shisui was known as part of the Fire Nation and not the Water Tribe. Plants don't eat. Stop lying to us, Zuko said proudly. He had always found the idea of plants doing anything other than sitting there taking up space waiting to be tended to or cut for firewood or charcoal silly. Silly Zuzu, Azula said, ignoring him, more interested in what Shisui was doing. Soon, a small blue flame appeared in front of the 3 children's eyes. It only lasted a few seconds before turning red-orange, but the sight completely shocked Zuko and Azula. Cool! Zuko exclaimed with his usual glee, seeing it as something cool to tell his mother and Mai about in the future, while his younger sister stared at Shisui's hands. You control water, why were you able to make blue fire? Is it because of the oxygen? Is that what happens when you use oxygen to enhance fire? Asked Azula after she came out of her stupor. She was smart, much smarter than her stupid brother who was always thinking of funny things. Azula may not have had all the knowledge that Shisui had, but she had something that every researcher and scientist had, curiosity. That's why she insisted on visiting Shisui's lab, even when he was just doing boring things like polishing a crystal to see the sky better, or what he called cells, but she always asked him questions, wrote down as much as she could, and searched her father's study for the stories and examples her partner told her. Yes, the 3-year-old Azula considered Shisui a peer, an equal. Not like Mai or Tai Li, both of whom she considered slightly below her because of their princess status. Shisui was similar because her grandfather paid attention to him, even if he wasn't a prince, he was somehow considered part of the royal family collective, not just a servant to be tormented when she was bored. Even though he was a waterbender, he seemed to know about all the elements, what rocks and soil were made of, what wind was, why water fell from the sky, and why fire was so important to human civilization. His stories broadened Azula's mind, making her realize there was more to life than creating flames with her fists and feet, which she excelled at more than her brother. It was only because of Shisui that she became interested in what fire was and what it meant beyond being a destructive weapon. Azula might have been a toddler of 3 years old, but her mind was sharp. When in doubt, she would ask Shisui directly, search for scrolls, and even ask those scholars of the court, but none gave her a better answer than Shisui. Well observed, Azula. The blue fire is the result of the complete combustion of fire, remember the triangle I showed you? Asked Shisui, seeing the girl nod, and he continued. Fire is the result of 3 things, we have fuel, in this case, your chi, the energy that flows through your body. We have heat, which is what you firebenders call the inner fire, although it's more something to do with your will or your mind anyway, that's why there are cases of defectors who lose their ability to make fire. The last element was the comburant, something that favors the flame, in this case, oxygen. Shisui created another blue flame, allowing Azula to once again admire the color of the flame that would define her life in the future. Next, Shisui placed a pot over this flame and controlled the water in a barrel to fill it, which left the 2 children somewhat confused, but Shisui was focused on what he was doing. Well, do you know what happens when you put a pot of water on the fire? Asked Shisui, looking at Zuko, at least he had to get this boy involved in learning. Yes. Water boils, it's obvious, the boy replied with a smile, not seeing the grimace on Azula's face, teasing him. So you think a waterbender can boil this element without using fire? He asked again, this time looking at Azula, who returned a look of astonishment with her wide golden eyes. You want to control the hot water? Azula's astonished question made Zuko look at Shisui strangely. Even children knew that waterbenders lived in cold places and preferred to freeze water directly during fights, so what was so good about boiling water? Only he didn't wait for Shisui's answer. Yes, so that I can have hot water to bathe in every day, the boy replied, ignoring the faces of the 2 children, but in his mind, he had other thoughts. Unlike fire control, which only increases the temperature and combustion of fire, water control is more of a way to touch temperature applications. Water, ice, steam, when I master them all, things like blood control, mud control, or plants will just be added. Shisui's golden eyes shone brightly as he watched the bubbles in the pot. Don't you have any hot water? Asked Zuko innocently, causing both Azula and Shisui to look at him. You're a little slow sometimes, Zuzu, Azula joked, although she wasn't too happy about the strange situation Shisui was living in, she didn't dare say it out loud, she wasn't as stupid as her older brother. Don't worry about those details. But do you know why things get hot or cold? Shisui asked, changing the subject to something interesting for the children. I don't know. Zuko answered truthfully. Look, it's that simple. Shisui went on to explain this and other topics in a way that even a child without much knowledge could learn. And when evening came, while the royal family and Shisui were dining, the Fire Lord's voice caught the attention of everyone present. Shisui, what have you accomplished in your laboratory? The man asked somewhat sternly, though his question caught the attention of his 2 sons, Iroh and Ozai. They knew that their father held the boy in high esteem and had even raised his status by force, but they had never thought that he would be interested in what Shisui had accomplished in his so-called laboratory. Oh, I isolated the element that allows us to breathe and makes the fire more powerful, Shisui said as if what he said wasn't that important, but his words made even Lu Ten, Iroh's son, who always remained silent at the table, looked at him strangely. What? Explain yourself. Azulon asked, causing Shisui to stop eating and look at the audience he had tonight. Through an experiment, I was able to obtain the element that in most cases allows the fire to start and spread, oxygen. This is present in the air we breathe in a proportion of. Shisui was explaining the data he had gathered through experimentation, not using his past life knowledge. He even noticed that the amount of oxygen in the air, at least in the Fire Nation, was higher than the normal average on Earth, which explained one of the reasons why the ancestors of this nation chose this part of the world to settle. That's interesting. I've noticed a special phenomenon. The flames we create on our land are a bit stronger than in other places. I didn't know it had something to do with the so-called oxygen in the air. Iroh, who had finished eating and was now drinking a cup of tea, was amazed. He didn't know that there were so many interesting things in this world, even in something as simple as the air he breathed. In a way, this proved to Iroh once again the hidden greatness of nature. And what's the point of knowing something like that? It's just nonsense, Ozai replied, not that he disliked Shisui, but it was his habit to question everything and everyone, even his father, even if he did it in private. It's simple, if we know the basics of our world and what surrounds us, we can do great things. Haven't you ever thought about why there are places where there are open flames? Especially where there is oil. Why the gunpowder and fireworks, with certain differences in proportions, can cause more powerful explosions. Or again, why do fireworks have such bright colors when certain components are added to them? Everything in this world is connected. We can even exaggerate a bit and mention that being that seems to appear constantly in our history, changing everything according to the time. Shisui's words plunged the table into silence. Ursa did not think that the child she once fed could have such an impact with his words at the age of 5, but there he was, fearlessly conversing with the 3 greatest figures of the nation, and best of all, holding their interest. You say. What does the Avatar have to do with your research and questions? Asked Azulon finally, asking the key question. Have you read the classics on the 4 elements that those alchemists have in their possession? When he mentioned those so-called alchemists, Shisui showed obvious discomfort. Those bastards had suggested that his ideas were foolish and that he should stop. If it were possible, the entire industrial revolution of the Fire Nation should be stopped. The only reason they weren't killed was because they were just a bunch of old bastards with no support, not even the Fire Temple could stand them. To me, the Avatar is more than the man or woman who controls the 4 elements. In essence, the Avatar can come to control reality itself, a god incarnate on Earth. For all practical purposes, Shisui's words made the 3 men looking at him give him 3 different expressions. Ozai showed some discomfort, Azulon showed dismay, and Iroh looked skeptical, but none spoke, waiting for Shisui to continue. What the Avatar does not control is not just the elements, it is what drives the elements. The Avatar has done what nature takes a great deal of effort to do, convert energy into matter. The Avatar is a great converter. Don't be surprised if one day another form of elemental manipulation is discovered and the Avatar suddenly knows how to do it. Even with the misnamed sub-controls, they are just an expression of the manipulation of energy and its conversion into matter by that being. Shisui's reflection ended, no complicated data or flowery words needed to be said. He was sending a clear message. The Fire Nation's greatest enemy was not the other nations, but the damn thing that had made energy its bitch with 100% utilization. 3. Real purposes. In the bathroom of his room, Shisui looked at the water barrel that was constantly emitting a light cloud of steam with an amused smile in his eyes, but contrary to what Azula or Zuko might have thought, he wasn't doing it by himself. Oh no, just the one in charge of preparing his bath, the one who was just getting ready to help him wash up, told him that he would have hot water from now on, so that was the reason for his smile. You seem to appreciate me more now, old man, Shisui thought as he closed his eyes to keep the foam on his head from irritating them. I imagine they will talk, but I hope that at least the boy's desire for war will diminish and that Ozai won't be such an idiot as to force his wife to kill his father, in the comfort that only someone who has a special servant to bathe him can feel. Shisui began to imagine what things Azulon and his sons might talk about tonight. Father, Should we slow down the war against Ba Sing Se? Should we show weakness? Ozai raised his voice a little, but it was because he didn't quite understand why his father wanted to slow down the conflict. They were doing well as it could be to be stuck on the outskirts of a walled city for decades, but that only showed the Fire Nation's fervent desire to take that city, so why stop? Iroh also had his doubts, but remained silent, waiting for his father's answer. Ozai also understood that he should do the same, so a few minutes passed without anyone speaking, until Azulon, sitting at the desk in his study, looked up from some papers in front of him. How much have we wasted on the useless sieges of Ba Sing Se, Ozai? The Fire Lord's question caused Ozai to quickly blurt out a series of data, and he even added his own opinions to the data he said, receiving a nod from his father. Even if you don't go to war, you're as good as a general, Ozai, but you lack something, you know that, Azulon said, causing Ozai to lower his head, but he felt a hand on his shoulder and when he looked to his side, he noticed the encouraging smile on his brother's face. Ozai, I don't care about the old man's position, he blatantly told Azulon, who snorted at his son's blatant disrespect, but he was so used to it that he said nothing. After all, it was his blood. Brother, you have advanced so far in politics and all things bureaucratic that you have neglected the martial arts. Yes, you are strong, I don't deny it, even though I feel that you can threaten me, and I have fought on dangerous battlefields. But you lack that, visibility, blood, for everyone to see you fighting for our country, and while I feel this might be an opportunity for the common people to appreciate you, I feel our father's motives are different, you too, right? Iroh's words made Ozai show a genuine smile. Yes, he was a manipulative bastard and even had some wild thoughts about the throne, but he knew that it was his fear due to the lack of a crucial element for his future ascension, but Iroh's words told him. You can fight. Not that he didn't want to, like all firebenders, it was a kind of innate tendency in them to want to fight, but the war had become a meat grinder that even his brother wasn't sure he would survive. Iroh had more wounds on his body than anyone else in the studio, but now he had a very good chance. Only, Iroh's last words reminded him of the dark reflection of a certain boy who lived in the castle. Shisui's words are worthy of attention, no doubt, Ozai said, somewhat uncomfortable with the very realistic view the boy had given them of the Avatar. They knew it was energy and matter, how could they not? The Industrial Revolution came to their nation first, and there must be scientific backing behind it, though the terms and the knowledge Shisui possessed seemed different, more advanced, and more refined. The idea that the Avatar was not only the master of the four elements but of energy itself, something that could somehow become whatever he wanted, frightened the three of them. Yes, even Iroh, who belonged to a certain secret organization. They only knew the Avatar's main mission, to maintain balance, but sometimes one wondered what balance was. The past actions of each Avatar meant only one thing, the balance was constantly shifting in meaning. Some Avatars did nothing relevant in their entire lives, others focused on supposedly fighting evil spirits, and others on correcting the behavior of some nations or groups of people. For goodness sake, there was an Avatar who wanted everyone in the world to have a mate and went from town to town as a wedding planner. The question is, what if one day the balance shifted to something else? Iroh didn't want to think about it too much, he just knew that the Avatar was fair in some way. Azulon and Ozai considered the worst-case scenario. What if the Avatar decided that the Fire Nation was a bigger problem than his thirst for expansion? What if he thought technology was bad for the supposed balance? If knowledge was a problem, if humans were the problem? Fair? Their balls. The Avatar was human, a being with corruption in his nature, and since the Fire Nation had caused him grievances in the past, why not think that the day would come when he would take revenge on them? It was easy, he could destroy their nation because, in a way, that was what the other nations would want. It would be fair to kill them in front of the rest of the world. This series of thoughts chilled Azulon and Ozai, who looked at each other for a second before subtly turning their attention to Iroh. Iroh, I don't care who you hang out with or what your ideas about the Avatar are, Azulon said slowly, causing his eldest son to frown unconsciously. Just remember one thing, you are a firebender of the Fire Nation, Azulon concluded before picking up the pile of papers. Ozai, take care of those so-called researchers and scientists. Who was the idiot who suggested a giant drill to pierce the walls of Ba Sing Se? I don't want idiots. Collect the information these vermin have been hiding for their benefit, compile it into books, and let me know. We need to reform the education system. Maybe Shisui was right about this. The Fire Nation already has soldiers, we need brains. Also, bring me that guy who lives in the Air Temple, he has some interesting ideas. If he refuses, break his arms and one leg, see if he likes having only one limb. Azulon passed the series of papers to his son Ozai. They were orders to be distributed and carried out to the letter. By the way, Iroh, get those generals together. Not only will the war in Ba Sing Se subside, but so will the attacks on the Southern Water Tribe. Those guys have nothing useful except women and children, just a bunch of useless hunters. Azulon's fierce words made Iroh grimace, but he nodded. For him it was good that his country's extreme ideas had a pause, even if only for a while. Oh yes, Ozai, do you want the throne soon? After raising his voice just now, Azulon changed his tone and asked this question, taking his two sons by surprise. Ozai didn't dare to lie at that moment. When a firebender reaches a certain level, their instincts and senses would allow them to notice some hidden subtleties if they paid attention. Yes, I want the throne soon, father. Knowing that Azulon's attention was on him, Ozai spoke the truth, but instead of seeing a frown on his father's aged face, he only saw a smile. You finally said it, by all gods, you don't know how annoying this place is, Azulon complained as any old man would, and even had a teasing smile on his face. I will give my last orders and start the educational reform. In 1 year at the latest you will sit on the throne. Your children will be the heirs, although I have more faith in little Azula. She has a great name and talent to match, don't you think? Asked Azulon humorously, causing Ozai, who had a mind full of conspiracies and machinations and even the desire to kill, to fall into a stupor. Cheer up, little brother. No, future Fire Lord. Iroh chuckled as he patted his brother's shoulder, snapping him out of his stupor and making him look at his father with an embarrassment that was unusual for him. You noticed, didn't you? Asked Ozai, bringing a tense atmosphere into the room. I saw your relief just now. Those dark thoughts came out of your head when I gave you the chance to go into battle, I know. I also had murderous thoughts towards my father, he had them towards his father, and your children will also have them toward you. It's normal, it's the education you receive that causes it. After all, I am old, and I have not shown any obvious signs of resignation, so tell me, did you want to use Ursa? Simple, but I would be careful with such a mentally fragile woman. Azulon's cold words were in stark contrast to the warmth or fierceness he had before. Iroh looked at his father and brother with some disbelief. What the hell, he could swear he'd never had such thoughts, but when he saw that his father didn't seem to be affected by it, he relaxed. Don't worry, I don't blame you for anything, just raise your children well, be more tolerant with Zuko. He's a fool, but he has a heart full of fire. Azula, on the other hand, must correct her sadistic tendencies, or they could be used against her, for she has inherited her mother's mental fragility, Azulon advised, then leaned back in his seat, which seemed to be quite comfortable. What are you waiting for? Go. Don't you know that old men like us are more active in the privacy of the night? Azulon gestured to shoo away his sons, who, as they left, watched as a particularly beautiful and shapely maid entered the study. Looks like the old man wastes no time, Iroh joked, only to be met with a grimace from Ozai, who had kept a straight face in front of the maid until his brother's bad joke broke his facade. Forget it, as long as I don't have a brother my age, I'll be fine, Ozai replied, showing that he also seemed to have a sense of humor. Ha ha ha. That would be funny, Iroh said before heading to his room. Ozai stood in front of his father's study door and thought about a few things. Only when he heard the soft moaning of a woman, followed by a certain familiar rhythmic sound, he decided to leave in a hurry. I hope Ursa hasn't fallen asleep, Ozai thought, who had a fire that he could only quench with his wife. The next morning, Shisui was awakened by a sunbeam that entered their room and hit him square in the face. He tried to cover himself with his arm, but his aura perception told him that someone else was in the room. Boy, don't be lazy. Get up. The old but powerful voice broke Shisui's illusion of wanting to sleep more. He couldn't do it, he recognized this voice. I'm sorry, Fire Lord, Shisui said quickly, sitting up in his bed and looking out the window where Azulon was watching the scenery. I understood your cryptic message, Shisui. Was it your purpose to slow the insatiable expansion of our nation, and that is why you used the avatar? Or do you have other intentions? Be honest with me, Shisui. Azulon's voice was soft, but the regal bearing reminded him of the first time Shisui had heard his voice. And although he had no grudge against Azulon, he did not like it when the old man got like this. I need time, our whole nation needs time, I need to get strong, and the Fire Nation needs to digest all it has accomplished in all these years, or it will fall into chaos. Shisui's words were direct, but they were the truth. Ignoring the plot, ignoring the fact that Avatar Aang might return in a decade and a bit more, two things were obvious, that he needed to get strong, and that to some extent, even if he didn't like it, this nation had become his base, so to speak. Aside from the horrible things that usually happen in a war, and the genocide of the air nomads, the Fire Nation had nothing wrong with it, at least they didn't have similar doctrines to a certain rejected guy from art school. As far as I knew, the situation that happened with the air nomads was unique and unrepeatable. Yes, Ozai tried something similar in the canon, but that guy is very different from the real one. The entire Fire Nation tries to avoid situations like that, which is why you rarely hear of one of them attacking women or children, not after the aberration committed that day under the command of Sozin, who even regretted it shortly after it happened. Shisui would not be guided 100% by what he saw in a show made under human prejudices. He was in a tangible world that could not simply be felt as something he could predict or control. So why not try to change what he could? The Fire Nation's situation could be better, and maybe they could direct that impulse to spread like wildfire elsewhere, like the stars. For, even in this world, you must go to school. Explain to me again why I should go to school. Shisui might be the only person currently using such a cold tone when talking to Azulon, but the man had recently retired and was playing the role of a kind grandfather. Brat, even with all your intellect and wisdom, there is something you should never let go of, the old man scolded as he tried to fish in a pond. It was a certain area of the castle gardens on a fine summer day, perfect for outdoor activities. I know, socializing, but how damn lazy. 6-year-old Shisui was performing a water-style kata, although if you looked closely, many of the gestures resembled the way firebenders fought, including their complicated pirouettes. Blame yourself, it was your idea to improve the school, you have to attend it whether you want to or not. Azulon ignored the brat's complaints. But if I want to learn, I can do it on my own, Shisui replied with a serious tone, although for a 6-year-old, it was obvious that it was just a childish facade. Don't you want to improve the status of the other master types in the nation? This is your chance. Azulon's words cut through Shisui's attempt at a serious facade and revealed one of his true motives. I guess there's nothing to hide from you, old man. What a bore, Shisui grumbled, pausing to watch as the former Fire Lord Azulon sat on a tree trunk like just another old man, holding a fishing rod. The serious and cold image I had of the old man was broken a year ago. It seemed as if the man had shed a heavy burden and let his true self out into the world. This somewhat eased the tension between Shisui and Azulon, especially since the latter, before retiring from his position, appointed him as his own grandson, without the right to the throne, but giving him a royal family status. There was outrage among the nobles and military, how could there not be? Until they were told that he had earned it for one simple reason, knowledge. The changes that began to be seen in the Fire Nation were largely due to him, including education reform. Did you know that the Fire Nation had very few educated people, many couldn't even write their names? Though Azulon had ideas to change that, everything was sped up by Shisui and his knowledge. They needed more people with brains instead of just muscles. Schools were no longer open only to nobles or military children. Every citizen of the Fire Nation had the right to an education, even if they came from the colonies. But not just any education, a standard education. From age 6 to 14, everyone would learn languages, math, geography, history, art, martial arts, and culture. Only 7 subjects, but they had the essence of everything that was necessary to learn at that time. A library was started where people could go and look for books or scrolls to learn, completely open to everyone. It was guarded by veteran soldiers to prevent the destruction of knowledge. Speaking of knowledge, it began to be classified in a better way. Now you didn't have to wait for someone who knew how to build something to pass their skills on to their apprentice, thus eliminating the risk of a certain technique becoming extinct because the possessor couldn't find someone to teach it to in their lifetime. Perhaps it was because the Fire Nation had a certain affinity for fire, but many people with talents related to blacksmithing and mechanics were discovered. A mechanical tank that used to take 6 months to build now takes a month, which explains the increased efficiency. Even terms like periodic table of the elements began to be spoken, constant exploration of the world was encouraged, and even the first magazines with an informative tone appeared, making people who learned to read aware of the wonders that existed in this world. The reforms and changes had just begun and needed more years to settle down completely, but even the nobles realized the essential, if they did not want to die, support. After the mysterious deaths of a few detractors, everyone understood that the Fire Nation was on a fast track, and no one could stop the progress of its changes. You know, dear grandson, I was once the lord of this nation. If I could not guess the thoughts of a brat like you, it would have been best to die at the hands of my son in the future, Azulon said with a smile on his face, though it was probably because he felt a fish taking the bait. Leave me out of this. Shisui simply looked down at the pond and gestured, raising a bubble of water containing a good-sized fish, which he placed in a basket. That's cheating, remarked Azulon when he noticed that the fish Shisui caught was much bigger than his. Not my problem, Shisui muttered before he started pulling out big fish without stopping until he had a dozen of them in the basket. You are too strange, Shisui. Have you been touched by spirits? Asked Azulon suddenly, causing Shisui to give him a strange look. The boy had a small twitch in his right eye. He couldn't understand why this man of regal bearing had turned into a chattering old man, but he knew he had to answer this question. Although he was joking, it was surely one of the old man's tests. A person touched by spirits was a person who could suddenly do or accomplish something that was thought to be impossible or difficult. It was usually a colloquial term used to be amazed by someone or to describe the beauty of a person. But in very special cases, some people might be in contact with a certain spiritual being who could help or advise them, thus enabling them to achieve feats that would be impossible for others. My knowledge I gain on my own. You've seen my laboratory, old man, Shisui replied, shaking his head for a moment before continuing. If I didn't do it, someone else would. I just took the first step, and many minds will join me in exploring the nature of this world. For example, that new Tun guy who started investigating why things fall the way they do. So no spirits appeared to me out of nowhere. It's just human curiosity. Shisui's words made Azulon raise his eyebrows. To this day, the old man was still amazed at the way Shisui did or thought about things, and he wasn't the only one who had the idea that the boy might have had contact with spirits. His children had suggested that this was most likely, coupled with the boy's intelligence that allowed him to accomplish so much, and best of all, everything he did was traceable. There was a clear process of why A went to B, why a thing was a thing. Everything was reproducible. His logic was not just sophistry or stratagem. When you thought about it, it really turned out to be so simple. Like the time he simply demonstrated his idea that the world was probably round with a big stick. Even Azulon didn't believe him until he proved it. He tried some arguments and proofs himself. Maybe it was all just wishful thinking, but Shisui knew how to navigate between every point he threw at him, even bringing up new evidence. But Azulon didn't want to admit that he liked the boy and cared about him. Shisui was very bright, but that was his problem. He brightened too much. He didn't seem to mind holding back, and he could even argue with those so-called sages at the fire temple. But Shisui was still a child, and Azulon feared that he would grow up badly. Yes, in a way, he was taking advantage of the boy and made no secret of his intention to use him as a tool for the good of the country, because he was the Fire Lord first and foremost. An isolated Shisui was not something he was interested in, and while the argument of making him a tool might not be as valid anymore due to his discovery that Shisui had much more value than a mere enforcer, he wanted the boy to have shackles and bonds. It may not make him love the land, but the school will give him friends, human contact, and even puppy love, all to bind him to the Fire Nation. Even. Azulon looked at the little black-haired girl running in the distance, right behind her brother. Perhaps I should prepare for the future and prevent some foolish noble from getting inappropriate ideas, Azulon thought, already organizing the way he would orchestrate the final point of his plan. Shisui was a national treasure and should belong to the Fire Nation. More specifically, to the royal family. Shisui. I brought you your backpack. Azula handed a small black bag to Shisui, who took it, feeling its weight. Mom helped us organize it. You have your notebooks, scrolls, inkstone, and brushes. I want to go to school already. Zuko showed off his red and gold backpack, excited that he would be going to school soon. Wow, you caught all this stuff. Azula, age 4, looked at the basket of fish on the floor. Yes, do you want some? Offered Shisui, putting his backpack aside. Good. I want to try raw fish with that spicy green sauce again. Zuko licked his lips at the thought of the dish called sushi. He didn't know where his friend got so many strange ideas, but some of them were delicious. Shisui, I want to train with you. Azula interrupted her brother's reverie with her dueling statement. Huh? Shisui looked into Azula's eyes. The girl looked quite determined and even seemed to have some athletic clothes. It seemed she had this idea in her head for a long time. Gee, fight her, Shisui. I want to see how the princess grows up, Azulon suggested, who seemed to be more focused on watching the fun than anything else. Well, I have no problem with you, just give me a moment. Shisui didn't want to refuse, because even if he was a reincarnated person, this life and his previous life had nothing to do with each other. It might be serious for a 6-year-old, but it was all a facade. He was just a brat who wanted to have fun. He had long wanted to fight and wreak havoc like any unruly child, but he needed to be more aware of his actions. Now that the adult present had given him the reins to go wild, how could he not create the perfect scenario? With an innocent smile on his face, Shisui slowly began to stretch. Why are you doing that? Asked Zuko, but only received a pat on the head from Azula. Silly Zuzu, he's stretching to avoid cramps. Azula began to stretch as well, ignoring her brother's pout. I'm not silly, the boy muttered, standing next to his grandfather. You're not, Zuko, but sometimes you need to think a little more about your words, don't just talk for the sake of talking. If you have questions, you can ask them at the end and in private, Azulon advised as he stroked his grandson's head. Unlike Azula, who seemed to have a natural talent for many things, Zuko was relatively normal, at least an ordinary child. Surrounded by a genius full of ideas and knowledge like Shisui, or a sister who seemed to adapt easily to everything, poor Zuko's life was perhaps the most strained after Shisui's. Grandpa, can I be as good as them? Zuko asked his grandfather in a low voice, and Azulon just took a deep breath. Yes. Remember Zuko, they are ravenous, explosive flames, but you are the little fire that slowly spreads through the forest and in time will cause a great forest fire. Keep up the pace, one day you'll catch up to them and you won't even notice. Azulon's words were a bit complicated for Zuko's childish mind. But he understood one thing, he was not the fool his sister made him out to be. Zuko seemed to regain the joy that only a child can have as he watched his sister and Shisui walk a few meters away to avoid accidents. Okay, I'll be the referee, I'll tell them when to start and when to stop, okay, spoke Azulon loudly, receiving nods from 2 children. Who do you think will win? Asked Iroh to his brother Ozai, both of whom had approached and stumbled upon the scene that was about to take place. As much as it pains me to admit it, Azula isn't ready to take on the little monster, Ozai said with some reluctance in his voice. That was the nickname he had for Shisui, whom he didn't know how to deal with, and he even had the idea of killing him, but he was too useful to have. Especially for the herb-based potions he began to brew. One of them really benefited him and his wife, a lot of dark thoughts had disappeared from his mind. Besides, Ursa seemed to be smiling more and more. 1. Shisui. You know, your mistake was falling in love with that woman. A man's deep voice echoed in the dark room, full of authority and a certain malice he did not try to hide. But my lord. Another voice spoke, but a slap was heard. Shut up, we're Fire Nation, fire, you idiot. Mixing with a lowly woman like a waterbender has already upset other generals, and you still want to defend yourself? The first voice scolded, and footsteps were heard. A man in red, gold, and black robes approached what appeared to be a wooden cradle containing a small child. When he saw the little one, who seemed to be sleeping peacefully, oblivious to all the commotion, a grimace of displeasure appeared on his face. As a general, hiding a waterbender could be considered treason, and if you hadn't had a child, I would have killed you right now. But in addition to being a Fire Lord, I am also a father. The man, who showed a somewhat aged face with gray hair, slowly brought his hand closer to the little boy. Then I give you two choices, sigh. Kill your wife and child and I will forget your blatant betrayal of our cause, or you may choose one of them, but you will be imprisoned like all traitors. The man laid his hand on the child's black hair, at least he had inherited that trait from his father. Those of the Fire Nation had certain characteristics that set them apart from other nations, their black hair and golden eyes being the most symbolic, and as far as the Fire Lord knew, the little boy before him possessed both, though his skin? It was tan, like those water tribe types. My lord, I choose my son, the voice replied without hesitation, though the trembling in his words indicated that it had not been an easy decision to make. But, could you protect him? I will give my life if necessary. This voice dared to demand, since it was all in the same shit, why not try to get an advantage for his son? Clever as always, General Sai. But you will die not by my hand or your own, but on the battlefield against the Northern Water Tribe. You like their women, don't you? Then die at their hands with what little honor you have left. Yes, Lord of Fire Azulon, the man shouted, and soon he was heard leaving the room. There was no need to hesitate or say goodbye to his son, he had something more pressing to do. Soon the sound of banging and breaking could be heard in the distance, along with the hysterical screams of a man and a woman. You evil bastard! All of you Fire Nation are bastards, the woman finally shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of an explosion. Soon after, there was only silence. What shall I call you now? Azulon completely ignored everything that had happened outside this room, focusing his attention on the infant he now held in his arms. He was a child of misfortune, that was what they called the little half-breeds born in this time of war. The Fire Nation's disdain for other nations was not just lip service, it was something more cultural, as they wanted to benefit everyone. Although miscegenation was inevitable, there was usually a very shady or sad story behind each of these children, and add to that the hatred produced by both sides in this war, and you have the perfect victim for ridicule and abuse. Will you be a firebender or a waterbender? Probably the latter, after all, you were born under the influence of the full moon, Azulon murmured as he rocked the baby. If anyone else saw him doing this they would surely think he was possessed by a spirit. But I suppose that would be an advantage because to integrate the other nations, we need to show them the benefits of doing so, right? You'll be the perfect tool for that, Shisui, Azulon said quietly. Before he put the baby in the crib and left the room, he had to make arrangements to ensure the child's growth. Well, I guess the standard of every reincarnate has caught up with me, but I never expected so much darkness in this sunny world, someone thought, and small golden eyes opened in the darkened room. The baby had been conscious all the time, and since no one would examine a baby closely, neither Azulon nor his supposed father had discovered that he was awake. Ironically, only his mother could tell when he was pretending to sleep, but that woman was already dead. Why did I fall for something so simple? Shisui thought weakly. The reasons for his rebirth were somewhat stupid, but the context was not. His previous world had completely gone to shit, simple as that. No one knows why, but suddenly, people started going crazy and killing each other, either violently or, like him, through trickery. Society collapsed, and it even occurred to some rulers to unleash some of those delicious stockpiled nuclear weapons, further screwing up the planet. It was as if something had been collectively activated deep inside the human mind, causing it to fall into utter chaos. Obviously, he was a victim of it, but at least he was one of the lucky ones. He didn't have those destructive desires like the rest and could control himself properly, but under the influence of whatever it was, remorse or guilt had disappeared, allowing him to calmly commit many heinous acts. I can feel guilt again. The baby realized that whatever had affected him in his homeworld had not followed him to this life, but something else had. Perhaps because the phenomenon was supernatural, many people realized that they possessed some special abilities, but they were nothing incredible like manipulating elements or anything like that. They were more subtle abilities, silent, nothing remarkable. It was as if this phenomenon chose certain people to make his killing easier, and he kept this a gift, as some people called it. He could see and feel other people's auras, each with a color and meaning, an ability that allowed him to survive for a long time. Until his stupid death came to him. No ability is invincible or omnipotent. A woman came into his life and showed him that not everyone has bad feelings towards others. With his self-control, he managed to avoid murdering her, and they built a relationship after going through many hardships, only for her to betray him by revealing that he had been chosen as her prey years before, and this was the way she chose to murder. She controlled her hormones and brain secretions to truly fall in love with him, fooling any ability capable of recognizing intentions, such as his own. On his deathbed, he remembered asking to go to a place of peace. Peace, my baby fists. This world is only beautiful when they fly over ATLA, mired in war and chaos, with an almost divine figure guarding the earthly plane, and who knows God what's in the spirit world. The baby mused with some regret, realizing that he had probably been noticed by those super dangerous spirits, like a certain mother he avoided mentioning. We can do some good, but I'm very sleepy. Being a baby is terrible. Shisui slept for a good few hours before waking up crying from hunger, a biological instinct in all babies. With his poor eyesight, not yet used to using his eyes, he could tell he was in another room, much better lit by the way. Soon, a calm woman with a baby in her arms entered the room and looked at little Shisui with a certain resignation in her eyes. It probably had a lot to do with the fact that he could release all his energy with his partner in bed. If you want to calm the mind of a potential maniacal ego conspirator like Ozai, fuck him. At least Ursa could attest to that. He's an interesting boy, Iroh said with a smile. He had benefited from the rich teas Shisui made, and the temperature control was perfect. Okay, start. Azulon's voice started the confrontation of two children, two future monsters. 5. Shisui vs Azula. When Azulon called for the match to begin, Azula was the first to lunge at Shisui to kick him. She knew her disadvantage was her size, so she would use what a firebender did best, kicking. Shisui defended himself with his hand, deflecting the force of Azula's blow to the side, then stepped forward and elbowed her in the forehead. Cold, direct, merciless, if the princess hadn't put her hands up to defend herself, she would already be on the ground from this attack. That boy has no respect for women, Iroh muttered, a little indignant at how ruthless Shisui proved to be. Azula is a fighter. No one will feel sorry for her gender when she fights. She understands that, and that's why she doesn't complain. Look how she smiles, Ozai replied, defending his daughter, which made him proud. Just seeing how Azula seemed to enjoy taking on others from a young age let the reigning Fire Lord know that his daughter would not be a trophy for whoever managed to marry her. Azula would be a strong woman. She just needed to be more careful. While Ozai did not consider the sadism his daughter hid in her bones to be a particularly bad trait, he did acknowledge his father's advice regarding her mental health. His ideas on how to raise his daughter had changed drastically some time ago, but now he seemed to have to put more emphasis on Azula's mental cultivation. While he was proud that she enjoyed fighting, he didn't want her to become a fighting fanatic. No, Azula would become something greater than that, and perhaps for the first time, Ozai had no dark thoughts about his children, only high expectations, at least for Azula. Zuko, well, a good fighter might be the best thing for him. How mean you are, Shisui, that punch was dangerous, Azula complained with a small smile, trying to take advantage of the tenderness her age brought her, though she secretly shook her hand, defending herself because it had gone a little numb. That was the idea. Shall I treat you gently, princess? Emphasizing the title in his question, Shisui managed to get Azula to jump on him again. The two were gentle at first, so to speak, exchanging simple punches and kicks. There was no need to move on to something more complicated, not yet. Azula realized that the size disadvantage would quickly become a problem, so she tried to stay in constant motion, not wanting to be caught in Shisui's attack range. The boy, on the other hand, focused on finishing the fight quickly, at least in the beginning. Realizing that Azula was as slippery as a rabbit, he decided to increase the pressure by using more complicated moves. Soon, Shisui was incorporating moves usually used by waterbenders. He had done it subtly before, but now his style became strangely airtight. All the blows Azula threw at him were not defended, but redirected to the side, even causing the girl to fall to the ground for not restraining herself in time. I never thought that watching those old men doing Tai Chi in the park would be so good, Shisui thought, his style becoming much more defensive, much to Azula's annoyance. Aren't you a man? Hit me. Azula childishly tried to provoke Shisui, who only stuck out his tongue in response. Grandpa, why does Shisui seem to be fighting with that dance he does when he controls the water? Asked Zuko curiously, not quite understanding why Shisui wasn't going for direct hits. Notice Azula's attacks, they don't hit even though it looks like they do. Each time she loses her rhythm and her breathing becomes agitated. Shisui is draining her stamina, keep that in mind. Never let a waterbender use their body, they can be especially annoying, especially if they have spears, Azulon advised, watching the battle between the two brats with a bit of awe. He had not expected Shisui to have such an understanding. Each nation had its style of close combat, inspired by the way they controlled the elements, each excelling in certain aspects. The fastest were the Airbenders, who were elusive, constantly in motion, and with strange movements. Unless you have prior experience, it is difficult to hit a good Airbender, especially when they use their gliders. The Earthbender's fighting style was more power-based, with grabs, punches, throws, or takedowns. They were generally the most physically powerful, and their blows were the heaviest, especially since they often used warhammers. A firebender was particularly balanced, but was also the most aggressive. Many of their attacks were combos, and they could even lift an opponent to prevent them from finding a way to use their strength. Swords were easy for them to occupy, especially because of the rhythm and momentum of their attacks. Waterbenders were slow, draining their enemy's power by deflecting or dissipating incoming attacks, and could even bounce the enemy's power against themselves. Their spears were used more to extend their range, but also to push the enemy away. Each aspect was emphasized in his way of controlling the elements, but Shisui had absorbed two styles of action, and though rudimentary, this fight allowed him to hone his way as a fighter a bit more. He then showed Azula her mistakes, changing his fighting style to the one he had understood and practiced by watching various firebenders. His fists connected with Azula's arms, pushing her farther and farther back. His attack was continuous, and every time Azula tried to defend herself or turn the tables, he would redirect his power to take over her legs and resume his barrage of fists. At one point, he broke through Azula's defense and punched her directly in the stomach, knocking the air out of his opponent, then turned his body to slam his leg into the girl's temple, knocking her to the ground. "Do you wish to continue?" asked Shisui, watching as Azula tried to get up. She nodded, then stood with her hand on her stomach. Her breathing was labored and she was a little dizzy, but she focused on Shisui. Azula noticed that her partner didn't seem to be using his legs much and seemed to have a slower speed than her own. She decided to concentrate on speed, but her intention was obvious, her attacks were easily intercepted. Azula became more and more annoyed. Shisui managed to trick her, he wasn't slow at all. Instead of attacking with his fists, Shisui began to move more and more, hitting with more kicks and even making some complicated moves, feints with his hands, or changes of direction with his legs when striking, constantly catching Azula off guard. Sure, Both Azulon and his two sons noticed that Shisui seemed to be experimenting. His transitions were stiff and his movements were predictable for someone with experience, but in a fight between children, it was downright crushing. But slowly, the two children began to fight on another battlefield. The mind. Azula had a worried expression on her face, but her golden eyes were constantly evaluating Shisui's actions, noticing something she hadn't before. Every time Shisui changed his style, there was a considerable pause and his movements were particularly slow. It could be a false signal, but as she watched this situation slowly fade away as the fight progressed, an idea flashed through the girl's mind. If you can improve, so can I. Azula's competitiveness was equal to her high talent. She took note of her mistakes and absorbed from her past experiences, falling less into Shisui's games. Although her stamina was dwindling and she had beads of sweat on her forehead, Azula managed to take advantage of one particular opportunity. When Shisui kicked hard at her left leg, she allowed the blow to flow, similar to what Shisui always did to her. Taking him by surprise, Azula made a move no one expected, bending straight down and grabbing Shisui's leg, only to pull back, stretching the boy's limb as he looked at her with some embarrassment. Luro, the girl joked before pulling back, causing Shisui to split on the ground without wanting to. Azula took advantage of this change in position and lunged at him, using her knee as a powerful battering ram to hit Shisui's X-arms, but his poor posture caused him to lack support and his body was pushed backward. Soon, Azula was on top of Shisui's body, trying to get her two knees around her opponent's head, but he used his hands to get in the way. Shisui rearranged his legs and tried to get up, but Azula pulled back and used her elbow to hit him in the stomach. Azula is capable, Iroh said, not expecting the princess to start a much more physical exchange. Of course, she's my daughter, Ozai replied with a rather proud tone. You're too heavy, Shisui told Azula. He didn't know why, but he couldn't get the girl off his back, and she was hitting his ribs and stomach too hard, making him lose strength. You're a softie, I'm not heavy, Azula smacked Shisui's head, annoyed by the misplaced comment. Really? I don't think so. It's because instead of controlling the fire, you control the food, that's why you eat so much. Shisui started to annoy Azula, seeing the girl getting red and distracted, and hitting his head all the time. I got tired, Shisui said suddenly, before shaking his body roughly and shaking his legs to support himself before standing up. Azula's legs were on his shoulder, trying to cling to his neck. The girl even started to pull at his long hair, but Shisui resisted the discomfort and let himself fall forward. Azula's back hit the grass, and though the height was not great, it was unbearable even for the childlike body of a firebender, so she let go of Shisui, who quickly pulled away from her. They both began to gasp for breath, but Shisui was the first to regain his strength. He needed it for what he was about to do. His golden finger, or the gift he received in his past life, he was going to see Azula's aura to end this fight. Activating this vision had always cost him stamina in his past life, and it would cost him stamina here as well, in addition to consuming his chi, which was scarce due to his current age. But it didn't matter now, he couldn't be defeated by a girl 2 years younger than him. Shisui took a deep breath and the three adults noticed the change in him. It was more a difference in his temperament. If before Shisui was a somewhat precocious child pretending to be serious, now he looked like a snake watching the prey he would squeeze to death or sink his teeth into. Is that your secret? Muttered Azulon when he noticed Shisui's current state. He didn't know what this strange impulse was, but he had noticed it a few times in the past, especially when Shisui watched the castle guards training or when he was in important meetings. Only the three adults, who had paid a lot of attention to Shisui in the past year, noticed this characteristic. Well, not only them, Zuko shivered at the sight of his friend like that and Azula got a bigger and bigger smile on her face. Are you possessed, Shisui? Azula asked to break her opponent's concentration, but Shisui just stared at her, even his head tilted subtly. The world before Shisui's senses had changed. There were no more figures, no more shapes, only colors that constantly warped in appearance, changed in hue, combined with other colors, or faded. He saw the colors that were Azula, a faint olive green explaining her lack of resistance, a ruby red explaining her excitement, and a dull yellow explaining her fear. These colors blended into each other, constantly changing places, but always fixing on where Azula should be. Fighting in this state took a lot out of him mentally, but it allowed him to see subtleties that his normal vision could not. Under his efforts, Azula's aura slowly transformed into the colorful figure of the girl, running towards him with a much richer ruby color than before, especially covering the previous yellow. "I just see you," Shisui replied, breaking his neutral expression and turning it into a smile. A step back, he dodged the hook to the ribs, a subtle move to the right, the slap to the face, a bend in his knees, Azula's high kick, and with a much more fluid movement than his normal state, Shisui hit the poorly defended area of Azula's abdomen. "You see too much," Azula said, quite annoyed by this blow, which was very different from the previous ones. Although Shisui had hit her much earlier, she hadn't felt as helpless as before, it was as if he had hit a weak spot. Shisui only hit where he saw 2 or more merged auras. It was a bit tedious, but he could further increase the damage caused by his hits. In addition, he was able to control his chi better in this state. Azulon, Iroh, and Ozai opened their eyes when they saw the specks of white light on Shisui's hands and recognized them as a manifestation of his inner energy. "I told you that boy was a monster," Ozai said to his brother after he had recovered from his astonishment. "I guess with this child's worldview, he must have some chi research of his own," Iroh replied to Ozai with a hint of respect in his voice. "Every living being has chi, it is normal and natural. It is the fuel of life and the manipulation of the elements by masters, but it is also a weapon for fighters. There are many classics about chi in the castle and the royal library, but usually, there was a lot of esotericism behind them. What if yin and yang? What if heaven? What if earth? Reading so many things made people dizzy, and people only learned the basics of chi, enhancing the body's potential and increasing the production of the elements. Other than that, no one but a few scholars, sages, or alchemists explored its applications." Iroh stopped stroking his beard and looked at his brother. Didn't he force those alchemists to give up their knowledge? Maybe he came up with something. After all, it was only after he got those scrolls that he started working with herbs. "And you know the feud between those fools and Shisui," Iroh theorized, making Ozai think. Those alchemists had refused to hand over their knowledge and heritage, mainly because they believed that the Fire Nation was destroying the treasure land with modernization. While the issue of pollution was taken into consideration, it was no excuse for treating the cause of the land in such a manner. Shisui went on a rampage against them, so he managed to convince the others to just take their stuff. After all, the alchemists were just apothecaries and potions with extra steps. But the interesting thing is what Shisui did. Anyone with training could emit a little bit of their energy to the outside, but usually, they didn't do it because it would evaporate quickly and cause an unjustified loss of chi, but the small lights around Shisui's hands were well controlled. It seemed simple, but as he fought, the boy's blows suddenly increased in power when one of those lights was consumed. Azula was full of bruises and the occasional scratch. It was obvious that something like this would happen during the fight, but even in her current state, she refused to give up. She couldn't just fall like that. Shisui was tired, his head aching from using his gift and wasting his energy on a rudimentary and imperfect technique, a bad combination when one already had low stamina. But Azula was too stubborn. She didn't want to stay on the ground, constantly getting up and coming at him with new tricks or tactics, even resorting to throwing rocks, dirt, or bites at him. Azula left a bite on his hand that drew blood. This had upset Shisui. He didn't want to have a girl's saliva on his hand. He was at the age where girls had lice, and he didn't want to touch them. Azula even used her disgust to throw spit at him as a fighting technique, which made Shisui very uncomfortable. He had had enough of the fight, he was hungry and wanted to make himself a nice fish soup. Then he thought of a somewhat unpleasant plan, but one that would work. When Azula ran towards him again and tried to kick him, Shisui closed the distance and hugged the girl completely. "What are you doing? Let go of me." Azula felt Shisui's arms tighten and started stomping hard on the boy's feet and shaking her head to punch him in the nose. "Only if you surrender," Shisui replied, trying to restrain Azula with a big platypus bear hug. No. Azula refused. You asked for it, Shisui resigned, quickly pulling Azula away from his grip and moving extremely close to her face, planting a kiss on her lips. The girl panicked, her face turning red, and she even brought her small hand to her face, but Shisui hugged her from behind in a standard grip, then pulled his body back, causing Azula's head to hit the grass and eventually pass out. Boy, I know you can do anything to win, but why the hell did you kiss my granddaughter? The atmosphere became hot as Azulon angrily approached Shisui. The hot atmosphere wasn't an excuse, the old man had a fireball in his hand and threw it at Shisui. Of course, this attack was more of a show than anything else, he even moved very slowly. But Shisui reacted instinctively, turning the water from the nearby pond into steam that covered the fireball until it was extinguished. Then the boy realized that he was surrounded not only by the old man but by all the men of the royal family, except for Lu Ten, who was absent. There's no other way, Shisui, you'll have to marry Azula. Azulon's angry face suddenly turned into one of happiness, and he even stroked his white beard. What? Shouted Ozai, Zuko, Iroh, and Shisui. The latter didn't expect this and even came out of the state his present was in. He only kissed a girl to win, not to marry her. 6. Steam power. Wouldn't it be nice to wait until we're adults and we can both decide our path? Shisui asked somewhat hopefully, but when he saw Azulon's fox-like grin that he had achieved his goal, he understood that he was pretty much screwed. Sometimes, things don't go our way, you have to get used to it, Azulon kindly advised, although his smile showed that he was more happy about the boy's snub than about the future engagement. Father, why? Asked Ozai tactfully. Even though he had already achieved one of the things he wanted most in life, he still treated Azulon with some respect. It was only now, in the position of Fire Lord, that he could understand all the effort his father had put in over the decades to preserve the Fire Nation, and even to achieve progress that had never been seen in the past. It could be said that the Fire Nation was entering what some began to call the Second Golden Age, a time almost as good as the country had experienced during the time of Avatar Ceto centuries before. He even found that he didn't have as many obstacles as he'd expected from the generals, who were no longer going crazy in the war. Perhaps it had something to do with the fact that he'd gone to the front to fight for a few months, and the lessening of the war conflict meant that many soldiers saw their family after a while. Don't you think they are suitable? Besides, the boy took the purity from the princess, there's no choice, Azulon started, pretending to wipe away his tears, much to the dismay of Ozai, Iroh, and Shisui. None of the three believed him, but Zuko did, who jumped at Shisui and tried to hit him, only to end up dodging a rather powerful kick from the Waterbender, who was in a fight-ready stance. Why did you kiss my sister? Asked Zuko angrily, and when Iroh tried to interrupt, Ozai and Azulon stopped him with a gesture. The two wanted to see how this genius really got along with an ordinary boy like Zuko. Yes, Ozai did not doubt that whatever talent his firstborn should have had been absorbed by his younger sister, but unlike the canon, he no longer looked down on the boy. I want to see what my father sees in you, Ozai thought, desperate to find out the meaning of his father's words. It was a trick to win, Shisui replied with a shake of his shoulders. Zuko, annoyed by such a careless gesture, tried to attack again, but was blocked by Shisui's raised leg, who turned his body and kicked Zuko in the chest. The Lord took several steps backward, reducing the force of the blow with each step. He was no genius, Zuko knew that better than anyone, but he trained hard, very hard every day. He even started reading those boring books and scrolls. Even if he had to meditate on their contents for a long time until he understood them, he never stopped. He didn't know why he was angry, but when he saw his sister lying helplessly on the ground because of a cheap and dishonest tactic, he became furious. You have no honor, Zuko said in his rage before he realized that his words were too drastic, but his mistake of speaking without thinking had already been made. I apologize. Zuko's turbulent emotions subsided as he apologized, but the cold look in Shisui's eyes told him that things were not going to be that simple. Don't apologize, I don't have it, at least I don't have the honor you think we all should have, Prince Zuko. Shisui's words were simple, but they made the little Zuko feel a strange pressure in his chest. Shouldn't we stop this? Asked Iroh, who didn't want to see the children ruin their good relationship any longer. No, let them work out their problems between friends, Azulon replied, sincerely hoping that Shisui would teach his grandson a good lesson. The words of an old man might not penetrate the mind of a child so much as an equal companion, and that was Shisui to Zuko. That was why he did not bother to interrupt, for in his mind, the unusual maturity in Shisui could guide the young prince. If it weren't for those sages who confirmed that you were not the Avatar when you were ignorant, I would have thought that you had inherited other lives, Shisui, Azulon thought as he narrowed his eyes slightly and stroked his white beard. It was obvious that he would have such doubts, for if the Avatar of the air nomad somehow died without them knowing, the next Avatar would be born among the Waterbenders. The intelligence, the wisdom of a child could be attributed to genius, but Shisui's maturity was something unusual that could alarm anyone. But with the relics of some past avatars provided by the Fire Temple sages, and a few tricks, it was ruled out that Shisui was the one. There was the idea that the Avatar was an old monster from the last century who had been training all this time, or perhaps he was wandering in the spirit world since there were records of Avatar Kuruk, all provided by Avatar Roku. Who would think that the Avatar was in a cryogenic sleep like a certain super soldier? And that he wasn't even an adult, but that subject would come up years later in the future. You see, Zuko, honor has many meanings and approaches, as well as its uses, both good and bad. I am not His Majesty Ozai to instruct you in the intricacies of honor, but I will remind you of one thing. I have my honor, and Azula has hers. Fighting like a true warrior and taking every opportunity is something Azula deserves because I respect her honor. Do you think she wouldn't use the same tactics if she could? No, she already does, she's already awake, Shisui pointed at the supposedly unconscious Azula, who opened her eyes and sulked. How did you notice? The girl asked before sitting down on the floor and shaking her hair. Maybe a bender's physique was really good because she only had a big bump on her head, nothing serious. Your breathing changed when your grandfather said we were getting married. Shisui's words made the girl's face blush as she started to play with her hair. Back to the subject, Zuko, I understand that you attach great importance to honor, but don't let it shackle you, and for the love of the spirits, think before you speak, you'll save yourself trouble. Shisui turned his attention back to Zuko, who had an embarrassed expression on his face. Zuzu sometimes says nonsense without thinking, that's why my doesn't talk to you, Azula added, hitting Zuko's little heart, who already knew what mistakes he had made, and so he walked towards Shisui. Shisui, I apologize for my rudeness earlier. Zuko bowed respectfully as he came to understand something very important. Maybe honor was not as rigid and complicated as those books made it seem, but something more flexible. And if he took the time to think things through, maybe he wouldn't have so many problems or embarrassing situations like this. Fearing the reaction of his father or grandfather, young Zuko looked up at the three adults present, perhaps expecting them to scold him, but instead, each of them gave him a different gesture. Iroh gave him a relieved smile, Azulon nodded, and Ozai just looked at him before giving him a small smile. Zuko didn't know what he had done, he didn't understand the meaning of those expressions until many years later in the future when he remembered this particular moment, but he was relieved because he wasn't scolded. It's good that you read and learn, Zuko, but sometimes things are not as written, sometimes it depends on the situation. And in a fight, even traps are valid if you haven't set a limit for them, Shisui said before making waterbender gestures and attracting a ball of that element. Don't resist, Shisui said, splitting the ball in half and bringing it close to the bodies of the two children, Azula's on her head and Zuko's on his chest. The areas touched by the water began to emit a warm bluish glow, Shisui doing his best to maintain his concentration as he healed the wounds on his companions' bodies. The mental strain caused his forehead to fill with sweat, costing him dearly, adding to his previous exhaustion from the fight with Azula. He could barely stand when he felt a pair of small hands on his back. Azula and Zuko approached him, holding him up to prevent him from falling. Azula looked at her older brother a little angrily but decided that the boy had enough, so she moved a little closer to Shisui, invading his personal space. Hey Shisui, Was that healing? The girl asked knowingly, and Shisui just nodded as he wiped the sweat from his brow. Shisui didn't pay much attention to Azula's strange behavior, just chalking it up to the children's curiosity and excitement after a fight, so he began to speak, oblivious to the subtle glances of the three adults present. Water can heal wounds when activated with chi, but it uses a lot of energy and is a bit tedious to learn, Shisui complained, but the excitement in his golden eyes only increased. Water is truly wonderful, you know. It is life, without it, every animal would die, including humans. It is death, its absence used to harm others is undeniable. It is destruction, floods, or tsunamis that are proof of that, but it is abundance, our rice fields depend on water, and our crops on irrigation or rain. It is peace, it is easy to think about, but it is turbulent, the currents of the rivers are an example. It is food, the mills that use the power of the turbulence of those rivers allow us to have flour for bread. It's power, especially when it's steam. Shisui then felt the need to demonstrate it in front of everyone, so he started using water control through gestures using the remains chi that his body recovered. Steam power had been used in the Fire Nation for a long time, there was a reason why their ships could easily reach the far poles of this world to wage war. But they noticed the difference, among Shisui's movements, there were not only those of a waterbender but also those of a firebender. As if what he had been able to refine in his previous battle was useful for this moment, Shisui drew a ball of water around him, which turned into a watery whip, and then bubbles appeared in it. Boiling water. He boiled the water, he didn't just draw it from a hot spring. Was it through the movements of a firebender? Iroh asked in amazement, but that excitement would only increase with Shisui's next actions and spread to the others. The boiling water turned into a white mist that covered both Zuko and Azula, but instead of burning them, the steam felt especially warm. The moisture on their clothes disappeared, as Shisui's control of the healing was not good, and he ended up soaking the children earlier. Don't tell me that if he learns earthbender moves, his ice will become harder, that would be dangerous, Ozai said, feeling that Shisui was still the same little monster, even if he sometimes acted like a child. The worst thing is that this child will be his son-in-law in the future. While thinking about this, Ozai noticed the way his daughter looked at Shisui and how she almost jumped at him, feeling that he had lost something. Luckily, the brat doesn't seem to notice, Ozai thought relieved. That would be a good experiment. By the way, Iroh, didn't you invent a lightning deflecting technique inspired by the waterbenders? Asked Azulon, who already had new plans in mind, such as learning more about the other types of elemental masters. Yes, my technique is inspired by their movements and the way they manipulate water. When I saw Shisui, I guess it was more than obvious that something could be accomplished if a waterbender learned from us. I wonder what other things will come from drawing inspiration from other elements. Fire with consistency. Hot gas. I can't help but imagine, Iroh said excitedly, perhaps he could ask for some extra guidance when he played Pai Sho with his friends. Great. You dried our clothes, is that what you're going to use the steam for? Asked Zuko, who was back to his usual enthusiastic state. That's the least of it, we can finally cook steamed fish, Shisui replied wearily. Right now he was hungry and the idea of many different dishes came to his mind. But he was also happy, he hadn't expected that a simple fight with Azula would lead to something he had been trying to achieve. Steam was a very interesting form of water, it could be cold or hot, turn into rain, snow, or hail, or just burn everything. Not only burning but exploding and pushing were also good uses. Although he had only used this ability as an express dryer for the first time, and even its future use for ironing clothes was already on his mind, the possibilities of this particular state of water were promising. Steamed fish. Shisui's momentary joke caught the attention of everyone present, who took a look at the basket of fish the boy had obtained. Shisui knew that he would go to sleep very tired today, but he would leave that to his future self. Now he was hungry. 7 stars. I must say I was very prejudiced against waterbenders before, I never really thought about the excellent applications and uses one could have with something as simple as everyday water. I think I owe you an apology for that. You just want another steamed fish fillet, don't you? Shisui cut through Azulon's dialogue without much shame or fear. The old man just touched his nose in agreement but said nothing as he stared at Shisui, who was skillfully preparing another piece of fish. First, he wrapped the body of the animal in a ball of water and then began the magic. Using the same water, he scaled the fish, removed its bones and organs, and cut it into several good-sized pieces that could be eaten. With deft movements, he evaporated only the water inside, leaving a thin layer on the outside to keep the food from falling out. In just over a minute, a fragrant piece of steamed fish landed on Azulon's plate, and all he had to do was salt it to taste and use some of that special sauce the boy had discovered a few years ago, wasabi, he told him. Why would a random root of a barely used plant become the condiment for this impromptu outdoor feast? Firebenders liked it. No, they loved the spice, so much so that there were few dishes that didn't carry its flavor. I want another one, Shisui. Lu Ten, who had been called by his father an hour ago, asked for fish for the third time, but the way Shisui made it was so tasty that he couldn't help but get a sweet tooth. Me too, called Zuko, who still had fish in his mouth. He had probably eaten in a hurry to order more, fearing that it would be over soon and he wouldn't be able to enjoy it anymore. It's been a long time since we've been out as a family like this. What a beautiful sight, Iroh said as he slowly ate the steamed pieces of fish on his plate and looked at the situation around him. The entire royal family had quickly built a bonfire on the shore of the pond and ordered the castle's servants to bring utensils for an outdoor meal as the sun was setting. Ursa sat beside Ozai, her mouth open as she accepted some fish from her husband, a romantic gesture they had rarely shared in the past, but the changes in known history had been drastic since Shisui's arrival in this world. Perhaps it was because Ozai's mind was more absorbed in his work as a Fire Lord, he was accumulating more and more pressure and stress, which his wife was willing to help him with. Added to the potions of a certain Waterbender boy, the relationship between the two had improved quite a bit. Ozai, without all his dark or insane thoughts, was a good man, perhaps driven mad by his upbringing and circumstances in the original story, though he was not given much depth beyond being the evil villain who had to be defeated. Shisui saw the romantic gesture they shared and sighed. At this rate, Zuko's younger sister would probably be born on both sides. Her mother would not have to take drastic measures to forget her suffering, changing many outcomes in the story. While preparing more portions of fish for Lu Ten and Zuko, Shisui glanced sideways at Azula, who was watching her parents' interaction with a strange excitement on her face, then looked down at her plate, only to give Shisui a look full of determination. Noticing Azula's eyes turn to him, Shisui looked intently at Lu Ten. This boy had barely been mentioned in the original story as Iroh's son and his greatest pain, but here was the boy, acting as a big brother to all the children present. He admitted it. The teenager was a young, approachable version of Iroh, with less extraneous lectures, but he helped out a lot when asked. Not only did he train with them occasionally, but he was also exceptionally talented in the art of swordsmanship, especially in the use of dual wielding. Maybe he was the one who told Zuko about the interest in double swords. The boy looked innocent, but according to rumors Shisui had heard, he was a real beast in battle, so he was especially interested in Lu Ten. Lu Ten, do you know how to use a spear? Asked Shisui as he served him his portion of steamed fish. The boy looked at Shisui for a second before concentrating on his rich meal, using his chopsticks to eat several pieces of fish soaked in wasabi sauce before answering the boy's question. Yes, but I'm not that good if we compare my skills with swords, Lu Ten answered truthfully. I would like you to introduce me to this weapon, Shisui asked as he prepared Zuko's portion. Are you sure? Choosing a weapon is choosing a path, you have to stick to it all the way if you want to excel. Lu Ten did not hesitate to advise and warn Shisui about his decision. A weapon was not just a tool to fight or defend oneself, it was, as Lu Ten said, a path, a way of living and experiencing the world. That was why the best with different weapons were those who dedicated themselves to it almost religiously. I have no problem, replied Shisui, who was now actually preparing portions of steamed fish for himself. He had only managed to eat one before he was surrounded by the requests of the others. Perhaps that will be the fate of every cook. Okay, we can train tomorrow if you want, Lu Ten finished before returning to his meal. But their conversation attracted the attention of a restless boy and a girl interested in improving themselves. Weapons? I want to learn how to use a sword, cried Zuko, imagining himself as one of those legendary swordsmen in stories who could do wonders with a single sword. Perhaps there was a strong touch of exaggeration in those stories, but with chi, a swordsman could indeed perform incredible feats if he was skilled enough. Weapons? I don't need them, but I'll watch you train, Azula asked the same as Zuko at first, but the rest of her words clearly showed the girl's thoughts. She didn't need weapons, just her fire bending. She knew that her full potential lay in that area, and she wanted to devote her full attention to achieving her personal goal. Are you sure? I heard you have a friend from a family of assassins, through her father. I don't know why he's a merchant now. What a thing, Azulon spoke to Azula, who shook her head. My uses hidden weapons because she is a non-bender, strong, but if I have a hot enough flame, she won't be able to hit me. Azula revealed her desire and thoughts. For her, as long as she achieves blue fire, she might not be invincible, but she will be incredibly strong. Little girl, the bravery of an assassin is never to fight head-on, but to ambush and attack from behind. Mai is a good girl to hang out with, along with this girl named Tai Li. The martial arts in her house are also pretty awesome. Never underestimate non-benders, or have you forgotten the stories of the Yuyan archers? They are capable of killing even very skilled earthbenders. Pride is good, but don't let arrogance consume you, Azulon advised, and Azula nodded, understanding her grandfather's message. Is Mai an assassin? Asked Zuko, not expecting the pretty girl Azula met to be a ruthless killer. Though she was silent, she didn't seem like a cold-blooded girl. They are. Their families have been in the service of the nation for centuries. Even though they are not as prominent now as they were in the past, their services have allowed them to obtain a fief if they decide to claim it, replied Iroh, who was quite familiar with Mai and Tai Li's situation. After all, the royal family kept an eye on certain types of people in the nation. These include not only the families of Mai or Tai Li, the Yuyan archers, the rough rhinos, the rare combustion benders whose teachings were passed from student to student, and the wise ones of the Fire Temple. Every member of this group of people was monitored by the royal family to avoid trouble and keep them in their fold, because even those boring fire sages had an understanding of things that could sometimes be very useful in certain circumstances. The martial art of Tai Li's family is really dangerous if it's trained skillfully. Shisui couldn't help but speak in favor of the girl who had a similar skill to his own. Only Tai Li's was more of a passive and less invasive vision than his, probably related to chi. Shisui didn't know if it was a natural gift or something gained through the techniques she was trained in, but still, he had no doubt that a master chi blocker was terrifying. With the right means, they could become a real threat to elemental benders and even the Avatar themselves, at least in the future. But Shisui didn't notice that Azula grimaced at the mention of Tai Li. Well, if Daddy can do it, so can I, Azula thought, before standing up, plate in hand, and approaching Shisui. Would you like some? The girl offered a piece of steamed fish covered in lots of wasabi. Azula had a hopeful look in her eyes, while Shisui looked anxiously at the excessive amount of sauce on the fish. He was not a firebender with resistance and a taste for spices. If he dared to take a bite of that, he would undoubtedly end up crying. But when he saw Azula's golden eyes, he couldn't help but feel the desire to taste. After all, it was only a gesture from a little girl like him, so he let himself go and opened his mouth to let Azula feed him. Sure, the others saw his face turn red despite his brown skin, beads of sweat trickling down his forehead, but the boy chewed his food with great pleasure, even opening his mouth again when he finished. If you're itching, why do you keep eating? Asked Zuko, seeing his friend's physical reaction, only to receive an angry look from Azula, who had finally realized her mistake. Shisui couldn't stand spicy things as well as they could. Just like the others, Shisui had a hard time tolerating the overly salty foods he sometimes ate, probably due to the waterbender's physical constitution. In a way, it was sobering to think about tastes and their relationship to the elements, but Shisui's mind was figuratively on fire right now, so he drew water from the pond and put it in his mouth, making it glow. He was healing, or at least showing his brain that signal. The heat was technically pain, yes, just as the embarrassment of others was pain. So he not only wiped off the remains of the wasabi but told his body that he was now healed from the painful wound. "I'm sorry," the girl mumbled, lowering her head in embarrassment as her cheeks flushed. "Don't worry, even though it stung, I enjoyed the gesture," Shisui said carelessly, not knowing that his answer only made the little girl's heart beat faster. Night had fallen, and Azula glanced sideways at the stars in the sky and briefly saw a shooting star pass by. She wanted to make a wish, but when she saw Shisui beside her out of the corner of her eye, she felt it was not necessary. January 1st, 8, full moon. Later that night. "So, shall we have this conversation again?" asked Iroh as he sipped the jasmine tea from his cup. He was sitting in a rather comfortable chair in the study of the newly ascended Fire Lord Azulon, his younger brother. In another similar chair, his father was sipping from a large glass of what appeared to be an unknown beverage, using a strange drinking utensil. "Yes, look, he even made this for an old man like me," Azulon replied, pointing to the object in his glass, a straw to sip any drink comfortably. "That's not what I meant, although it's a good idea, especially with that lemonade with sugar. I never thought you could make something so sweet out of beets," Iroh replied, watching with some envy as his father enjoyed his nice cold drink, courtesy of Shisui. "It's not the Avatar Reborn, the tests proved that, didn't they? The fire sages already told us that." Ozai, sitting behind his mahogany desk, touched his temples, trying to relax for a moment. "He wasn't possessed by a spirit either," Iroh said, perhaps the most spiritual of the three, and using the methods of the sages, he was able to determine a crucial fact. Shisui did not even have a residual aura from the spiritual world, which ruled out possession or contact with such beings. Cases of people being influenced by these beings have already been reported in the available literature. Some artists could learn new songs or ways of making art and even inspiration for writing through contact with spirits. However, a possessed person could even suffer physical deformities due to gradual exposure to these beings, in addition to going insane. Shisui did not even have any deformities. And although he was a little strange at times, he was not insane. But the three of them did not fully understand why he was so wise, where his knowledge came from, and why they could accept him even though strange things happened to him. In a way, this was Shisui's real danger. It could be his personality, the charm of a budding scholar, or something superior, but the three men present realized that as long as the boy usually talked about what he was passionate about, usually knowledge, they were enveloped in his presence, so to speak, and did not doubt the strangeness of the situation. It wasn't mind control. They could doubt, question, and even correct Shisui, but when it came to those topics or some more serious ones, people tended to treat him like an adult, like the knowledgeable elder in the group. "Wait." Ozai thought of something and couldn't help but speak, drawing the attention of his father and brother. "What happened? Did you think of something?" asked Azulon, causing Ozai, who had his head down, to look out of the closed window. Ozai stood up and walked to the window, the other two standing behind him to follow. When the man opened the window, he looked straight up at the sky, full of stars and clouds, but what stood out the most was the moon. The full moon. "Father, what was the moon like when Shisui was born?" Iroh asked suddenly when he noticed that his brother was staring at the moon in the sky. Azulon grimaced as he remembered what he'd done that night. That general deserved to be punished for hiding an important threat, especially since Shisui's mother was not just any waterbender, but his past actions were just that, past. Shisui proved to be truly valuable, and even he felt a twinge of remorse for his hasty decision that night, but at least he had found ways to soften his relationship with the boy. Azulon suspected that Shisui already knew the reasons why he had no parents, only neither of them ever broached the subject. "It was a full moon." The old man answered somewhat reluctantly, but when he felt Iroh's hand on his shoulder, he pulled himself together. At least Shisui is committed to Azula, the old man thought, realizing that at least he had managed to solve a ticking time bomb for the nation. Someone as wise and eager to improve as Shisui was indeed a danger, but fortunately, his grandchildren took it upon themselves to bond with him, especially Azula. And even he was trying to forge even a tenuous bond with the child, lest he create the nation's worst enemy besides the Avatar. Father, do you remember why Grandfather Sozin attacked the air nomads? Asked Ozai, not taking his eyes off tonight's moon, which seemed brighter than usual. Because he feared the reincarnation of the Avatar, who was his childhood friend. Is that it, reincarnation? Asked Azulon, somewhat intrigued. Yes, it's not the reincarnation of the Avatar, but what if it's the reincarnation of someone else? Iroh's question brought the three of them closer to an answer. If Shisui is the reincarnation of someone else, how do you explain his special wisdom? Azula is smart, but she's just a child. Shisui is more than smart and you know it, Azulon pointed out. Reincarnation existed in this world, the best example being the Avatar himself, the greatest exponent of that fact. But there was a general consideration that the reincarnation of others was different from this being. The Avatar reincarnated in a new life, but kept the imprint of his past life, which he could access under certain conditions. A normal person could hardly achieve something similar, and if he did, it was to a lesser degree. The moon, father, the moon, Iroh pointed to the sky, causing Azulon's eyes to light up. I see. Perhaps a sage from ancient times, reincarnated in Shisui. Influenced by the full moon and the spiritual connection between it and the Waterbenders, something from his past life may have seeped into his new self, Azulon mused aloud, but his conclusion caused Ozai to shake his head. I don't think so, the experience of a sage could overwhelm any baby, it must be something else. Ozai stopped looking at the moon and turned to face his brother and father. Did the moon allow the spirituality of his past life to drip onto his new self, filling him with a different vision? A vision that no child would have. It could also explain the child's strange ability. Ozai's conclusion partially convinced the two men before him, but doubts remained. Perhaps an inordinate amount of such spirituality. I noticed that the boy's energy consumption increased when he entered that strange state in his fight with Azula. A child's mind cannot withstand the wisdom of an ancient sage. Iroh scratched his head in confusion. Iroh felt that he would have to start searching through the ancient archives to find out who that person might have been, but there were so many outstanding men and women in the past. Who could Shisui's previous life have been? The child meditates constantly, perhaps as a way to assimilate his former self in an accelerated manner. That's why he's getting wiser and wiser. A strange phenomenon, but not uncommon. Azulon sipped the rest of his lemonade before speaking to his two sons, who looked at him expectantly. As a child, I was interested in learning more about the Avatar. You see, he was a friend of my father's before he started the war. I found an old story repeated in some dusty scrolls about the Avatar of the Presido Fire Nation, a very nice woman indeed. It is said that the female Avatar had a series of encounters with a rather peculiar man, who not only possessed knowledge that few had at the time, some of which was even lost, but he was also very different, as if he had a large library in his head. This person, of whom it is not said whether he was a man or a woman, even popularized some strange political ideas, of which we only have names like democracy, capitalism, free market. These were ideas proposed by some guys in the Earth Kingdom, but centuries before the time of the story. He was a ruthless person, he killed his opponents at every turn, and he seemed to love to steal women, as if he was not used to the time he was born in and was stuck in his past until it occurred to him to force the female Avatar of that time to be with him. The Avatar won and destroyed him, but it is said that at the end of the battle, the Avatar commented, "You are a soul from the past, overwhelmed by the spirit world and the passage of time." Since then, there has been a belief that many reincarnated people have something to gain from their past selves. Wise men, brave warriors, and even despicable villains have been reincarnated throughout history to continue their exploits, though only a few have access to knowledge of their past lives, usually appearing around the Avatar of that era. It is said that even Sito encountered a woman whose past self may have been a former Earth King, and whose ideas caused that Avatar to refine his political ideas of the time, bringing prosperity to the nation. It is worth noting that these types of people tend to be born at times of great spiritual upheaval. Full moons, comets, eclipses, earthquakes, hurricanes, tidal waves. All phenomena related to the spiritual world seem to favor their birth, although they are extremely rare and very obscure cases. Could Shisui be something like this? Probably, which would also explain the way we get involved in it. Sages in particular have the ability to attract everyone's attention when they teach. Or have you forgotten the conversations with the leader of the Fire Temple? It wasn't until I stopped talking to him that I realized the bastard had me all wrapped up and cajoled. Azulon finished the long story and then popped a piece of ice in his glass into his mouth, obviously courtesy of a certain boy. Wow. But when you think about it, it makes sense. Even I, in some of my deeper meditations, have come to see some fragments of my past life, though I learn nothing from them. I never thought that anyone could replicate the Avatar's specialness, even a little, in that respect. Maybe I should ask Shisui for help with meditation. Iroh let out the breath he had been holding for a long time, feeling that the mystery finally had an answer and that he had gained a new interest in his past life. Maybe he had been a waterbender in his past life? It would be ironic and something particularly revealing, so Iroh thought about the possibility of helping Shisui with his training if the latter would give him guidance in meditation. So, is Shisui aware of this? He has to be, and he doesn't seem to care much about his particularity, Ozai said, leaning back in his seat and sighing deeply. At least they had solved one problem. He's probably aware of his oddity, who knows what children have in their heads. But we shouldn't worry, those people are rare in a per era, although sometimes they don't show up. For example, there was no such person in the Yangchen era, in the Kuruk era, nor in the Kyoshi era, nor in the Roku era. For eras, so that would explain why this kind of knowledge is so unpopular. The concern is, will the Avatar return? Shisui has been born, which means that one may soon appear. Azulon's conclusion caused the room to fall into a tense atmosphere until Ozai began to draw up an order on a scroll. I will organize a special squad to investigate spiritual phenomena in the world. If something like that happens, it's either spirits or the Avatar. The search for the Avatar must continue, the man said with some tension in his voice. It would not be good news for the Fire Nation to see the emergence of such a troubled entity. Iroh was a little uncomfortable with his brother's particularly hostile approach, but he was no traitor, so he decided to nod. He was a member of the White Lotus, but also a Fire Nation general, so it was best to seek balance on both sides, at least until it was no longer necessary. Iroh hoped that peace would come to his people. Father, can you find the scrolls? I would like to study them, Ozai asked with some interest in his eyes. Sure, I am old, but I have a good memory. If there were no political problems, I would give them another brother. Azulon then began to vividly tell how he still had the strength to further expand the royal family, ignoring the uncomfortable faces of his two sons. Avatar World. There will be no otherworldly or Avatar-worldly reincarnations during this story, maybe in the future when Shisui dies and there is a brief mention of his reincarnated self, who knows. So don't worry. As far as I know, some types of meditation can, theoretically, allow you to see parts of your past life, and some people claim to be reincarnated. I doubt it, but who knows, or maybe they have knowledge they weren't supposed to have at the time, filtered from their past life. I think it was Buddha who, after attaining enlightenment, was able to see and relive all his past lives, unlike the Avatar who can only talk to his past selves. Anyway, to those who have commented on this paragraph, thank you for your comments. Did you like this way of resolving the situation? By the way, Happy New Year! Thanks for supporting this fanfic, 2.4K collections as I write this, FUCK, I never thought it would stick so much. My Dragon Ball fanfic has only 1.2K and my Reincarnation fanfic has almost 300. And my original novel, Steam and Heart, only has 20, but details. Go read it, I swear it's good. Sincerely, thank you. Seeing your comments, your conversations, your doubts, questions, and comments is something I appreciate very much. They encourage me to write and make me better as a writer. 9. Spear, Sword and Fire. It will sound strange, but the spear is also the dragon among weapons, although it is ironic that it is the water tribe that uses them more than we of the Fire Nation, forgetting that, it means that the spear is a weapon of pure power. A spear is a perfect weapon for stabbing, thrusting, sweeping, and blocking, but as you may have noticed, it is particularly effective at the former. Spears are the best weapon for hunting large beasts and for forming phalanxes. Lu Ten instructed Shisui on how to use this spear. It was only the day after the impromptu celebration at the edge of the pond, but Shisui did not want to waste any time and wanted to learn his weapon of choice early on, for both cultural and personal reasons. Of all the weapons, swords and spears were his favorites, but in his particular situation, a spear would undoubtedly suit him best, so he finally chose it. Of course, he would learn about swords, hammers, and bows, but his main focus would be on the spear. So, under Lu Ten's guidance, he began to perform basic exercises with the weapon, though contrary to what one might think, it didn't lead directly to combat routines. "Do I really have to do this?" complained Shisui, who was holding a long wooden shaft with no metal tip, making it an incomplete spear. He was standing, simply holding the shaft while pointing it skyward. The training ground was an open one, and the morning sun was getting hotter and hotter, making Shisui a little uncomfortable. "You have to get used to the weight of the spear, that's why I told you it would be better to wait a few years until your body is stronger, but you refused, so you have to go through this process at your young age," Lu Ten replied with a teasing smile on his face. It was rare to see Shisui as nervous as he was now. "And why do I have to stand in the sun as well?" Zuko's voice was heard. He was standing next to Shisui with a thick-edged metal sword, standing in the sun like his friend. "Because the sword needs it too, all weapons do. Did you think that training was just to use the weapon against a dummy and hit it wildly? No, everything has a process. If you get bored and don't want to go through it, you can leave." Lu Ten looked at his cousin and explained seriously, making Zuko nod. "Okay. After an hour I'll show you the basic routines and we'll practice them. In the meantime, I'll go warm up." Lu Ten turned away from them until he stopped a dozen meters away. The young man brought his hands to the two swords sheathed at his waist and quickly drew them, making a whistling sound as he sliced through the air. The two boys and Azula, who were watching from under a nearby tree, turned their attention to Lu Ten. The boy began to move, his steps smooth but measured, never out of proportion. His weapons danced softly as he waved them, and in a short time, he was doing what could be called a sword dance. Nimble, fierce, but most of all, beautiful. The children didn't quite understand what they saw. Shisui might be a reincarnated human, but he didn't live in a time where cold weapons were common and he only used them for entertainment. But even though he understood that he could not defeat Lu Ten in single combat, the way the young man controlled his strength, his breathing, and his stance, even without swords, he would be a fierce fighting machine. "Concentrate on your weapons," Lu Ten said when he noticed the attention of the two children, giving them a warning. And so the children did, even though it was tedious. The two of them concentrated on the weight of the weapon they were holding, the way it swung when they got careless, and how they could grip it in a way that was much less cumbersome and tiring. Indirectly, they were developing a sense of balance for their weapons. It was only a vague notion, but they already knew how to wield it effectively without it swinging or shaking all the time. Azula, for her part, was doing her thing, meditating. Yesterday's defeat only fueled the fire inside her to get better and stronger. She didn't feel sad because yesterday outweighed any negative emotions she might feel. In particular, Ursa had talked to her about many things the night before, nothing too deep or extensive, but it allowed Azula to understand the full meaning of Azulon's words. "I'm going to marry Shisui, we'll hold hands and have children when we grow up." Azula's thoughts gradually wandered to what she understood, but she soon tried to whiten her mind. Still, her cheeks were red and her mind kept going over everything that happened yesterday, getting more and more upset. Just when she thought her meditation was about to go to waste, she remembered something basic about firebenders. Emotions and feelings were fuel for the fire within, and by adding up the energy within and the breath, a firebender could create flames. Why meditate, trying to calm herself, when memory-laden thoughts might be a better way to deepen her power? Unbeknownst to her, Azula had discovered another aspect of meditation, introspection, perhaps the most useful part for fire and earthbenders due to the nature of this section. While stillness and tranquility were useful for waterbenders and airbenders, emotions, feelings, and memories were best for firebenders and earthbenders. Meditation, except for some local mystical aspects of this universe, was not really something very complicated or mysterious. Anyone could meditate, regardless of age or status. Guided by her breath, Azula found herself immersed in a mental torrent that she slowly came to control, but the progress was obvious. She did not know it, but this exercise would give her power and mental health in the future that her canonical version would never have. She was gradually taking control of her emotions and the process of feeding that fire within her. One would think it was metaphorical, but within every firebender was a flame of a spiritual nature, and as the hours passed in her meditation, a small spark of that flame was turning blue. Of course, Azula was not experienced enough to look inward and explore her body like some chi masters, but when she opened her eyes, the sun was at the height of the day. She felt particularly comfortable, but she thought it was because the grown-ups were not just talking when they said the midday sun was something that could slightly empower firebenders. Then Azula saw her older brother and her fiancé training hard. Zuko was performing the basic sword movements with a rather serious expression, and even though his movements were not standard, the improvement in them was visible. Zuko put all his energy and concentration into his weapon, accepting Lu Ten's corrections with ease and evaluating his every action with exaggerated attention. Azula thought for a moment that she saw the image of a mighty warrior in her brother, but she took it as a passing thought. How could Zuzu be a mighty warrior? Stronger, better, stronger, better, stronger, better, stronger, better, stronger, were the two words Zuko repeated to himself with every action, like a mantra he used to hypnotize himself. Lu Ten looked at his cousin with an unusual gleam in his eyes and recognized something in Zuko, a sign. If spears were dragons, then swords were kings. Usually, these meanings were mystical or metaphorical, but Lu Ten was a war veteran at 17. How could he not see that his cousin Zuko was somehow in a state of self-suggestion? Lu Ten then realized that in the royal family, one could not be born without talent, as some rumored. Yes, Azula was a firebending genius, Shisui was a timeless research genius, and Lu Ten was a fighting genius, but Zuko didn't stand out much. His intelligence was average, his firebending was average, but with the sword. With the sword, Zuko was a genius. It was as if he was born to wield that particular weapon. He would probably be average with other weapons, and only with a good sword in his hand could his potential be unleashed. Lu Ten noted this in his mind and thought he should talk to his father. Maybe he could say something to his uncle Ozai to allow the boy to learn from the best swordsman in the Fire Nation, Piandao. He figured it would be easy. He had seen his father play Pai Shou with the man who, in Lu Ten's eyes, was undoubtedly the best swordsman in the world. Piandao's mere presence felt sharp as if the wind following him was full of blades. The young man then turned his attention to Shisui, who practiced in a completely different way than Zuko. With each movement, he would pause and close his eyes for a few seconds before resuming his training. At first, Lu Ten did not understand why, until he noticed that the wooden pole was covered with something strange, and when he looked closer, it was small specks of white light. Shisui had tried to integrate his energy into the weapon, and the resistance he felt bothered him greatly. He wanted to train his chi control while performing the basic movements of a spear, but when he realized that it wouldn't work, he decided for another way. I can't imbue an object with chi, but I thought the weapon would be different. The spear movements didn't help, so let's try the next best option, Shisui thought before controlling his chi so that it came out of his palms in specks of light. They were fickle and some of them even fell apart on the outside, but the ones he could control properly clung to the weapon. This made the boy smile as he concentrated on practicing. The spear is a dragon, water is the element of oriental dragons. What if I explore this mystical side? Shisui wondered as he slowly integrated the repetitive movements of a spear into his muscle memory. What beautiful lights, a little girl suddenly spoke next to Shisui, who had already noticed the presence of a stranger in their vicinity. A pair of girls who did not fit into the sporty atmosphere of the place. The one who had spoken had long brown hair and brown eyes and looked at Shisui with a smile on her lips. The other was too somber for an infant. She looked calmly at everything around her, and Shisui even caught hints that she was superficially focusing on her vital points, only stopping when their eyes, both golden pairs, met for a moment. Azula. I didn't know Shisui could make such beautiful lights. The smiling girl approached the princess lying under the tree. This is new, by the way, Azula replied as she shook her shoulders. Too flashy, Mai said coldly. It wasn't very common to see a girl acting like that, but that was how she was and people had already gotten used to her way of being. Do you think he can teach me? The color of Shisui's aura when he does that is also very pretty, very white. Tai Li's words made Shisui grimace slightly while Azula looked at her friend with a pout. Oh. Azula, she's jealous. Shouted Tai Li when she saw the changing aura of her princess friend, and without thinking she blurted out what came to her mind. Don't worry, friend, I'll steal those books from my mother and help you defeat Shisui, Tai Li said with an expression that a normal child should not say at her young age, expressing her desire to help her friend. Tai Li, you shouldn't read things from adults. Although Lu Ten didn't know what the hell those books contained, it was probably not something a minor should know. Why is your aura a color of shame, Lu Ten? It's just a book. Besides, for everyone's salvation, Mai put her hand on Tai Li's mouth, although she had to remove it quickly and wipe it with the tree. You licked me. Although her tone was neutral, the annoyance was more than obvious in Mai's words. Why do you always interrupt me when I'm talking about other people's auras? I don't interrupt you when your aura turns pink at the sight of Zuko. This time it was Azula who covered Tai Li's mouth and stared at her, waiting to see if the girl would dare to lick her hand. Thank you, Azula, Mai thanked her with a small smile on her face, even if it was only fleeting. Zuko, who had stopped his training because of the noise, noticed this little gesture on Mai's face, and from that day on he never forgot it. Although he didn't know why at the time, he discovered it in the future during an afternoon of meditation. By the way, what are you doing here? Asked Shisui, trying to change the topic of conversation to something easier. Tai Li wanted to visit. She was jealous that you and Zuko will start school soon and wanted to see your backpacks, Mai replied, causing Tai Li to nod quickly like a chick pecking at her food. Yeah. How jealous, I want to go to school too, but waiting 2 years is boring, Tai Li said after freeing herself from Azula's clutches. It's not as fun as you think, Shisui said annoyed, still complaining that he had to go, but there was no other way. But we'll make new friends, Shisui, Zuko replied after wiping the sweat from his brow with a handkerchief. For some reason he didn't want Mai to see his sweaty face. Doesn't take the boredom out of it, Shisui simply replied as he walked over to the tree where the girls sat before manipulating the sweat from his body to throw it to the side and then leaned back in the shade. Shisui, will you teach me how to create these bright lights? Asked Tai Li, bringing her face very close to Shisui's in an invasive way. If you give me space, yes. Knowing that the girl would insist on it for a long time, Shisui decided to comply. It wasn't very complicated anyway. A short time later, everyone was resting on a blanket under the tree, brought by one of those handy palace servants. By the way, a certain Jasmine Tea fan, who wanted to talk to Shisui, joined the group and watched as the aforementioned boy started one of his usual chats. Knowing that he's probably a reincarnated sage, his words take on a different meaning, Iroh thought before he was shocked to hear Shisui speak. Let's talk about chi and its nature, or what I have discovered with my tests. Shisui's words made Iroh thank the spirits. He wouldn't have missed this for the world. 10. About chi, what do you know about chi? Shisui asked, sitting comfortably on the blanket with his legs crossed while the others listened. Iroh, who quickly called for his father and brother, heard such a question and instinctively wanted to answer, but when he saw the raised hands of the children beside him, he let them answer. I know, pick me, shouted Tai Li, who was eager to answer, and Shisui nodded in her direction, causing the girl to give a small clap before speaking. Chi is the energy that runs through our bodies and allows us to do many interesting things, Tai Li said, answering in her usual cheerful tone, but Azula grimaced next to her. No, chi is the power that allows us to do fire bending and hit harder, the girl replied without waiting for her turn. Chi silences us, Mai replied, mumbling her words out of her habit of avoiding noise. That's too many answers. Which one is right, Shisui? Asked Zuko, who preferred to let his friend clarify the matter. All three, but none of them. Shisui's words made the three girls stare at him as if they wanted him to choose just one or explain himself better. Chi is whatever you understand it to be. How can we categorize something as ethereal and sublime as chi? Although that is the inherent need of human beings, the conclusion I have come to is this. Chi is everything, it exists in everyone, but at the same time, chi does not exist, it is nothing. Shisui's words confused the children present, and even Iroh felt that perhaps Shisui was wrong, so he spoke up. But little Shisui, chi can be felt and controlled, it is part of who we are, it even allows us to make fire or allows you to control water. Iroh felt that perhaps the young Shisui was confused and had probably fallen into a deep mistake, so his words were a reminder of something obvious. Are you sure? You haven't thought about it, have you? Asked Shisui with a smile on his lips, and those who knew him understood, there was something the boy hadn't said because he wanted to play mysterious. Be more clear, Shisui, Azula said, a bit annoyed by Shisui's strange humor, causing Shisui to stick his tongue out at her. Well. Chi exists because we believe it exists, it comes from us because we believe it is within us, we use it as an engine for our actions, and even as an enhancer of our actions because that is what we have been taught. But in essence, chi is nothing, it does not exist, we can live without knowing of its existence, and I am sure that before the concept of chi was created, the existence of chi did not exist. What is chi if not the materialization of our breath, the essence of our being? Mind and body are connected in a certain energy, designated by our desire that everything has a name, everything has a category. Chi is your breath, it is the nutrients you get from food, it is the sunlight you get on your skin, it is your memories, it is your thoughts. It is the influence of the stars, it is the movement of the earth, chi is your own existence expressed in energy. Shisui's explanation of chi was somewhat confusing, and noticing the expressions of those present, the boy breathed. Chi is a product of our movement and stillness, a reflection of yourself, that is why in some people we can use chi detection to discern their inherent nature, because deep down, chi is the purest of them, something that cannot be hidden or manipulated. Chi is what you understand, if Azula thinks chi makes her fire burn brighter, it will be her fuel. If Ty Lee sees it as something that enables our actions, her family's chi block will work. If Mai thinks chi will silence her, chi will soften her habitual noises. In essence, you are the chi is you. It is in everyone, it is in no one, it connects us, it isolates us, it makes us part of the world, but at the same time, it makes us individual. It is your knowledge and what others understand. Chi is change. With Shisui's last words, a strange wind came from nowhere. Suddenly, even Azulon, Ozai, and Ursa, who had just arrived as Shisui began to explain the nature of what he believed chi to be, felt the change. Everyone present could feel that the atmosphere had become strange, the air more breathable, nature more alive, the colors more vibrant. Suddenly they saw what appeared to be a small sparrow flying around them, only this one was very unusual, it looked like a line made with green paint, outlining its shape but not its inside, which was hollow, so to speak. The bird chirped, interested in the strange creatures it had encountered. This is... Iroh murmured in awe, for he knew what he saw, that the sparrow was a spirit, no doubt about it. The spirit world is not a separate place from the earthly world, although its ways are mostly closed, it does not change its true essence, it is superimposed on our world and is the ultimate expression of the basic concept of chi, change. That is why in the descriptions the spirit world seems to have no end, except for certain special places. The spirit world is a constantly changing place, constantly transforming, reflecting the nature of chi. There is no time as we know it, no distance, and even, we can try to call upon certain special entities, though we must be careful. Shisui stood up and looked at the reflection he had drawn into the real world. Yes, at his young age, it was impossible to reach the spiritual world, let alone take more people with him, nor had it drawn him into the earthly world, it simply created a reflection, or rather, removed the veil between the two worlds, but the barriers were still there. They could not get in and nothing could get out. It was like seeing through a glass. That's why the sparrow couldn't be touched by Tai Li's curious hands. They were technically isolated. "Young man, it looks like you've done something really great here," a deep and aged voice was heard in the drill ground. Everyone's attention turned to the direction it came from. An old man with a white beard, red clothes, and deep golden eyes looked fondly at those present, especially Ursa, Azula, and Zuko. Perhaps because they were experiencing a reflection of the spiritual world, Ursa and her children felt something stir within them that made them feel close to the old man. "Why do you feel like my grandfather?" asked Azula boldly, making the old man smile. "Because I'm older than your grandfather, little girl. Your mother is my granddaughter," the old man revealed, making Azulon finally confirm who the person in front of them was. "You are Avatar Roku." Azulon finally revealed the identity of the old man, causing him to nod. "You are the son of my friend Sozin, I can see that, though you are much more temperate than him." Roku nodded to Azulon, then focused his gaze on Ozai, who was wearing the Fire Lord's robes. "Take care of my family, please," Roku asked Ozai solemnly before turning to Iroh, giving him a smile and showing him a Pai Sho token, the one with the white lotus. "We could play sometime," the Avatar invited before turning his attention to his two grandchildren. "Grow up well, little ones." The Avatar seemed to sense something and looked directly at Ursa's belly, then began to laugh at what he found. "Congratulations to both of you." Roku's words were somewhat garbled until Ozai realized in which direction the old man was looking. "Ursa, you..." Ozai approached his wife with an unusual concern for him. He wouldn't have shown it before, but long ago the rough edges of his being, at least those concerning his family, had been smoothed out. "I've been feeling sick for a few days now and I didn't tell you because I thought it would pass. I never thought." Ursa touched her belly with an expression full of motherly love. It was obvious now that she was pregnant again. "Little girl, you should smile more. Eternal silence is for old people like me." Roku looked at Mai and gave her a little advice. "Say something to me too, Grandpa." Tai Li exclaimed excitedly, causing the Avatar to stroke his beard for a moment. "Just be yourself," the old man advised, making little Tai Li jump with excitement. "You are more than anyone can imagine." Roku stared into Zuko's eyes and spoke the words he most wanted to hear, causing small tears to fall from his eyes. "Destiny is not fixed, I hope you continue to dance freely." Roku dedicated these words to Lu Ten, who didn't quite understand the meaning of the first part, but accepted the end. He really liked dancing with his swords. The one who understood the meaning of those words was Shisui. He knew more than anyone else that Lu Ten was supposed to die at some point in the original story, but would he really let that happen? No. To hell with the canon, to hell with fate, to hell with everything. Lu Ten may never know, but the stormy little butterfly that was Shisui allowed him to continue dancing with his swords as he pleased. Roku glanced at Shisui before moving on to Azula, whom he approached and crouched down beside. "Girl, I've been watching you for a while now. You have an extraordinary talent. I hope you won't be overwhelmed by it in the future. You are more than a fleeting flash. You are a star in the sky." This was the first time Roku had said something so long to those present, but he felt it was necessary. Of all the people here, Azula was the one he cared about the most. The girl was his offspring, and she inherited some of the excessive talents that all avatars had throughout history. There had been examples of similar cases in the past, but it could be said that Azula was a bit more special than them. Roku decided to give the little girl some special advice to prevent her from falling apart in the future. "Now, Shisui, right? Your way of looking at energy is especially interesting. But you should be careful, many spirits are not so friendly." Roku finally turned to Shisui, who looked at him with a small childish smile on his face. "I know, old man. I never expected it to be you. I thought it would be one of these people's ancestors. But since you're here, can I ask you something?" Shisui was perhaps the only one present besides Tai Li who was not that impressed by the Avatar, and Roku noticed. "Ask the old man, but I warn you. I'm not a god, I'm just a man." I don't know everything, the avatar agreed easily. He really wanted to know what someone like Shisui could ask him. Not only he, but he knew that other avatars were watching hidden, for they were interested in such an unusual situation as this. Maybe that was the reason why no great spirit had approached. Imagine having almost 10,000 years of super powerful past lives looking at a single place. Not even Vatul in his prime would dare to peek. Shisui took a breath, knowing that his words might cause some misunderstanding in the future, but he didn't want to miss the opportunity to ask this question. It was important, more than any secret he might have. Why was I reborn? Shisui asked, causing Azulon and his sons to look at each other, a gesture the boys saw. I didn't think you would ask this question, little one. But isn't reincarnation a natural thing? I'm an example of it, so it's no wonder you can too. Even those who are now were someone else in the past, but that doesn't have to affect you too much. Your past self has nothing to do with your present self, you understand that, don't you? Change. With Roku's words, the reflection of the spirit world seemed to tremble a little, and for a moment, the avatar's eyes turned white. You are part of this world, of its cycle, of its changes. A new soul, a new body, a new you. Your memories are echoes of the past, and you are gifted with something that is part of you. That is why you have such a special ability. Do not be afraid, but since you like to find your own answers, I will give you advice from myself and my former selves. Roku's voice under his new state seemed to be overlaid with many, many unfamiliar voices, and suddenly the entire training ground was filled. Filled with hundreds of figures with different clothes, different heights, and different genders, but they all had one thing in common, the immense power emanating from their bodies, their eyes shrouded in white light. Such an image was astonishing, and even many of the world's most spiritually sensitive people looked in that direction. At the North Pole, a white-haired princess looked up at the Fire Nation. Two fish that swam and danced forever waved their fins as if responding to the presence of all the past avatars. A blind girl playing with mole badgers felt a strange vibration in the ground, something she had never experienced before. A little girl at the South Pole, playing with a water bubble with her mother, saw for a moment a distant glow on an iceberg, something that would lead her years later to actively explore that place. An immortal in the Earth Kingdom glanced toward the Fire Nation, then shook his head. He didn't care what the avatars were doing for any reason. The remaining dragons breathed multicolored flames, and the remaining flying bison of this world roared into the sky. A certain bald child of the air nomads, who had been in cryogenic stasis for nearly 100 years, stirred slightly, causing a few cracks in the ice that covered him. However, it would be a long time before he was released back into the world, and until then, he would continue to sleep while everyone waited for his return. Everyone somehow felt the changes that had occurred, some were curious, others guessed what it might be, but soon they went back to their own. The warriors returned to training or fighting, the wise to studying or inventing, and everything went back to normal. If you want to explore the depths of your soul, succeed in reaching the spiritual world, and then seek the mirror of souls, it will allow you to get answers to your questions. Until then, live your life as usual, without fear. You are a child after all. The avatars spoke in unison, all synchronized uniquely. Each of them expressed different emotions to him: compassion, tenderness, love, care, protection, caution, and discomfort, but all of them were sincere in the end, because even though he was reincarnated, Shisui was still just a little boy of 6 years old. Thank you. For the first time in his stay in this world, Shisui cried. For the first time in his life, he felt at home, accepted. He was not an outsider, he was not an external entity, a foreign stain on the world. He was truly part of this place, this real world. Shisui's chi emerged from his body like tiny specks of light. The ones he had resisted manifesting before were now much more comfortable. Because he got an answer, a way, a solution. He finally accepted himself, finally understood that he could live in peace, without fear that another catastrophe out of nowhere would ruin him. Or worse, that it was just a dream, an illusion. Grow up and live well, Sage Shisui, the avatars declared at the end, bestowing the child with a title of great weight before they began to fade away one by one. Roku was the last. his transparent body looking up at the sky of his nation and breathing a sigh of relief. He could see that the Fire Nation upgrade was powered by the little boy before him, and that brought him peace. When the spirit world reflection ended, Shisui was wrapped in someone's warm embrace, and he noticed that it was Azula, who put her face on his chest. She clung to him and said nothing, but she made Shisui stop crying. After all, children didn't stay sad for long. "Let's go play with the turtle ducks," Shisui murmured, feeling that it would be nice to just hang out and do nothing but play for a while.